Hello everyone, good morning. It is 7 o'clock and this is Sky News Breakfast. And as the King prepares to take the stage at the COP28 summit in Dubai, back home he's being named in unsubstantiated claims as one of the royals who questioned the colour of his grandson's skin. Will this overshadow the government's agenda at COP28? We will put that question to the Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, in just a couple of moments. It is Friday, the 1st of December. Also coming up today.
The 7 a.m. deadline came and went, but no extension to the truce in Gaza could be agreed. Israeli airstrikes have resumed across the Strip.
And I'm live in Dubai, where the King is expected to tell world leaders the hope of the world rests on the decisions they take here at the Climate Summit.
Buckingham Palace says it is considering all options after the King and the Princess of Wales have been named in unsubstantiated claims as the royals who questioned what skin colour Harry and Meghan's unborn son would have. Former Health Secretary Matt Hancock has admitted that despite his assurances, the country's care homes were not fully protected ahead of the second part of his sessions at the COVID inquiry. Snow continues to blanket parts of the country, with temperatures expected to drop as low as -10 and yellow weather warnings still in place.
And in sport, police make 39 arrests outside Villa Park, with 4 officers injured in clashes with Legia Warsaw fans. Elsewhere in Europe, Liverpool, Brighton and West Ham secure their places in the knockout stages of the Europa League.
A very good morning to you. The fragile truce between Israel and Hamas has expired. Sirens have been heard over Gaza and southern Israel, and Israel's defence forces say they've resumed combat in Gaza. Let's go right to our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, who joins me now from Jerusalem. Ali, good morning to you, but bad news. To what extent was this bad news expected, and how bad has it been? Fighting has already resumed?
I think it was inevitable that at some stage the ceasefire, the temporary ceasefire between the two sides would come to an end. There was, though, having said that, still a hope amongst the mediators that it could be extended further still. So it lasted for 7 days in total, during which time dozens of hostages were released, and in turn the Israelis released Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. But once we'd got to a stage where most of the women and children had been released, the negotiations went into a new phase, and you started looking at men of fighting age and IDF soldiers. And so it was becoming far harder to find common ground between the two sides. And of course, Hamas would have wanted a far greater price to release any IDF soldiers they have captured. We understand that Hamas did not provide, or were told through Israeli media that Hamas did not provide Israel with a list of hostages to be released later today. And so when the 7 a.m. deadline here came and no agreement had been reached, the fighting resumed. There's been air raid sirens around the border communities in Gaza, and Israeli airplanes are back up in the skies above Gaza once again and carrying out airstrikes across the Strip.
Ali, there's been a lot of meetings and conversations between Western world leaders and Israel's leaders in recent weeks, some of them public. The president of the US tweeted about the topic a couple of days ago. Of course, some of it behind closed doors. Secretary Blinken's been in the region of late. Do you think Israel has taken on board some of the messaging, some of which we've seen, some of which we don't know, about what fighting is seen as legitimate from this point on?
Yes, partly because I think they'll have to. They do need American backing. They're not going to lose American support completely, but if they don't heed Washington's warnings about having a more targeted, more precise plan for the next phase, when we talk about the next phase, we really mean southern Gaza. If they don't heed those warnings and, I'm sure, friendly advice, then I think US opposition will grow to an extension of this conflict. And so what the Americans have been saying, at least in public, is that they must be much more careful about operations in the south. You cannot have a widespread bombing campaign like they did in the north. They have to protect humanitarian areas like hospitals. The White House has said it does not want to see another major displacement of civilians, as happened when about 1 million moved from the north to the south. They don't want to see a repeat of that. And of course, all countries want to see the humanitarian aid continue to flow into Gaza. Now, the humanitarian aid, or at least the expansion of that, was a part of the truce agreement. So we'll have to see whether or not that is one area that can remain, even though the rest of the truce is now over.
Well, Ali, I was about to ask about that. I mean, I guess in a slightly backward-looking way, how successful was that part of the last 8 days or so? Did a lot of aid get in?
We saw around 200 to 220 trucks of aid going in every day. That's medicine, food, water, shelters, desalination equipment, fuel, crucially, as well, which the Israelis were most worried about because they were concerned that Hamas would steal that fuel and use it for their own operations. So that humanitarian aid, of course, I mean, absolutely vital, and has helped relieve what was a bit of a crisis. But actually, 200 trucks is still way below what Gaza would expect to receive on a normal average working day during peacetime. And so more aid is going to have to keep coming in. The crisis doesn't go away. The need for that aid doesn't go away when you have so many people who are now internally displaced. And so I'm sure that even if the fighting resumes, there will be mediation going on to make sure that the aid flow continues.
Ali Bunkel, as always, thanks so much. We'll be back out with Ali throughout the morning here for any updates as and when they do arise. Alistair Bunkel there. Meanwhile, Sky's Asia correspondent Cordelia Lynch spoke to a recently released Thai national held hostage by Hamas. Her special report is coming up at 7:30. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines this morning. And rail passengers are being warned to expect disruption over the next week because of train driver strikes in their long-running dispute over pay. Members of the ASLEF union at 16 operating companies will strike from tomorrow until Friday the 8th of December. Of course, comes after better news with the RMT union earlier in the week. The Culture Secretary has launched an investigation into the takeover of the Daily Telegraph by an Abu Dhabi-based fund. Sky News understands Lucy Fraser tasked the Competition and Markets Authority with examining the jurisdictional and competition matters, while Ofcom will look at the need for accurate presentation of news. Both regulators must report back by the 26th of January. The number of children in temporary accommodation in England facing homelessness this Christmas has hit record highs. The government statistics on homelessness show almost 139,000 children were living in temporary lodgings between April and June this year, a 10.5% increase compared with the end of June last year. Let's get some thoughts now from the government on some of this morning's top stories. I'm joined now from COP28 in Dubai from Energy and Security and Net Zero Secretary Claire Coutinho. Very good morning to you, Ms. Coutinho. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Clearly you're there at COP28, and one of the keynote speakers today, in our time actually on the breakfast show, will be the King. As you no doubt know, the newspapers here are covered with a different factor for the King, which is the questions in and around the race of his grandson and whether he'd questioned that before he was born. Do you think the head of state is racist?
Look, I don't really think any of these things are matters for government ministers to get involved with. They're matters for the royal family. The work that I'm doing here at COP28, alongside the King, the Prime Minister and our Foreign Secretary, is talking about global climate change and the actions that we can take to mitigate some of those actions. That's the bit that I'm focused on.
It's interesting. I was working in a New York newsroom when the original Oprah interview came out, and I would say it didn't just lead people to question whether the royal family was racist. I think it even led people to question whether our country was racist, and I just wondered what you had to say to that.
Well, look, I think we have a wonderful, welcoming, tolerant country. We do really well in a lot of these things compared to other countries around the world. You can see that from the diversity of the British cabinet at the moment. But like I said, my focus is on climate change. That's what I'm doing in Dubai at the moment, and that's what I've been working very hard on this week.
And do you think the presence of the King helps you with that, given that so clearly he has been ahead of the curve on this issue?
I mean, undoubtedly, I think if you look at the King's work, credit to him, he was talking about the environment way before it was fashionable. But the UK as well has been a world leader on this issue. So we've cut our emissions faster than any of our international peers today. We have some of the most ambitious targets going forward. We really are world leaders when it comes to things like clean energy or things like climate finance. And that's the expertise that we're bringing to the table here in Dubai this week.
And do you think this summit is critical to progress there? I mean, I'm sure you saw Greta Thunberg's comments about these COP gatherings earlier in the week. She said it's more blah, blah, blah. Clearly, the fact that we're talking about COP28 does show that they're not definitive on their own each time round. What's your view about whether this summit is diminishing in its importance?
Well, this summit is an important one because we are going to have a global stock take, which is looking at what the world has done since the Paris Agreement in 2015, and then set out new agreements going forward. So it is a really important summit. I think the work that we've been doing, and we've made some announcements today to protect the world's forests, for example, and we've set out some new funding today, £500 million to do that. It was something that the UK pioneered, so at COP26, for the first time we got 140 world leaders to sign an agreement on the world's forests. That is incredibly important, not only because we care about nature, we want it protected, but actually if you look at the effects of deforestation when it comes to carbon emissions, there are enormous effects, much more than our emissions actually as a single country. So the steps we're taking forward are really important. Yes, there's always going to be more to do. That's the work that we're doing and negotiating very hard for in the next couple of weeks. But alongside the work that the UK has done, we need other countries to do the same as well.
Do you think that there's sometimes too short-sighted a view on the pragmatic side of implementing some of these much-needed changes? And when you're out there, do you get pushback on some of the changes that your government, that the Prime Minister has made in terms of trying to rationalise the overall approach to reaching net zero, even if that is still the ultimate goal?
So overall, people look to the UK as a bit of a poster child when it comes to net zero. Like I said, no one in terms of our international peers have cut their emissions as fast as us, and even going forward, if you look at 2030, we have the most ambitious targets. I mean, we're planning to cut carbon at 68%, the EU is cutting it by 55%, and the US is at 40%, so the UK is enormously far ahead, and I don't think anyone disagrees with the fact that we need to be very logical and hard-headed about this, because this is a practical problem. There's no winning in being ideological about it. You've got to think these things through very carefully, which is why in recent weeks you've seen us make these decisions, which is to protect household finances, to shield UK households from the worst costs of net zero, give people a bit more time. But then we've also been turning the dial up on clean energy. So we've been making big announcements when it comes to the electricity grid, when it comes to the supply chain for clean energy, which have been widely welcomed by people who care about the environment. And I think that is exactly the right approach.
And I also just want to ask you, Ms. Coutinho, what the UK government position is on, and advice, I guess, to Israel's government on the restarting of fighting with Gaza, which no doubt you're aware of has begun this morning. Is the Prime Minister going to pressure Benjamin Netanyahu to alter his tactics, or is it still pretty widespread support for whatever the Israeli government feels is necessary?
Well, I mean, I think it's first important to say that I think the truce was actually broken by Hamas. And look, of course, it's disappointing that fighting is resumed. We've been pressing very hard for there to be a pause because it's really important to get hostages, British nationals out and to get aid in. But at the same time, Israel has to defend itself, and they're in a very difficult position with having people on their doorstep who've set out that they want to harm the Israeli people. So we will be having conversations today today, the Foreign Secretary's out here in Dubai and the Prime Minister, they'll be talking to counterparts. It's important that we try, as I say, to focus on getting hostages, British nationals out and aid in, and those are the conversations that they'll be continuing to have.
Coutinho, thanks so much for joining us. Now, Buckingham Palace says it's considering all options after the King and the Princess of Wales were named in unsubstantiated claims as the senior royals who questioned what skin colour Harry and Meghan's unborn son would have. Well, with me now is our correspondent, Milena Veselinovic. And Milena, Claire Coutinho didn't really want to address the issue, which is understandable. But the newspapers are definitely carrying this as more of a front-page aspect of the King's story today as opposed to his speech at COP.
And that's certainly not something that Buckingham Palace would welcome. It is pulling away the focus from the work that the King would like all of us to be talking about. He's a keen environmentalist. He's about to address a really important international summit, COP28 climate summit. All of those issues very close to his heart. But of course, we can't get away from these headlines, these allegations that first emerged in a Dutch translation of a book by Omid Scobie, a journalist who also co-authored a book about the Sussexes' split from the royal family. But the odd thing here is that he says that he never submitted a text containing their names. And the Dutch publisher has now pulled this book from the shelves, citing an error. So it's a bit of a mystery as to what exactly happened here. Now, we know about the allegations of racism. They first emerged in that Oprah interview that Harry and Meghan did back in 2021. They didn't name anyone then. They did clarify later that they weren't referring to either the Queen or Prince Philip. And in an even later subsequent interview, Prince Harry said that they weren't actually accusing anyone of racism, but it was more a question of unconscious bias. But we're getting back into the weeds of it, back to this old ground and really taking the focus away from what the royals would like us to be talking about, which is COP28. Of course, they are carrying on business as usual, which is what they usually do in these kinds of situations. We've seen the Princess of Wales last night with her husband, the Prince of Wales, at the Royal Variety performance show. They didn't make any comments. And of course, we are going to see the King address the summit shortly. And
just quickly, Milena, we've got some of the front pages now. They took a while to get the graphics ready. We'll float through them as we continue the discussion. But I think it's fair to say there is a key difference, apart from the extra storyline of how did these names appear in a Dutch version if it wasn't in the English version, which we talked about a lot yesterday. There is an added significant difference to, as you said, when the Oprah interview first aired, and these front pages do capture it, which is questioning the whole storyline in the first place rather than accepting it.
Yeah, and the palace, we understand, is now discussing all options, and you can extrapolate from that could potentially include even legal options, which would be quite extraordinary. But I think it speaks to the strength of feeling of how this allegation really struck to the core of how we see the royal family, and perhaps in a way they feel that it is maybe a bridge too far to stay silent. They usually don't, they don't explain, don't complain. That is their default mode. But in this situation, I think there's a real sense that, all options are on the table. There was a similar allegation a couple of years ago in another book against King Charles. And at that point, Buckingham Palace said that it was all fiction. I think they are being drawn to commenting about this more so than they have had at any point in the past, which in itself is quite extraordinary.
Milena, great stuff. Thanks so much. Milena Veselinovic there for us. Now, as we've been mentioning, the King and the Prime Minister are in Dubai for COP28. The King's expected to tell the world that hope of the world rests on decisions taken by world leaders at this UN summit. He's due to give his opening remarks at a little after 8 a.m, and we'll bring those to you live, of course. Meanwhile, let's go to our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, who's at the conference for us. Tom, pivoting away from the King and his storyline at this a little bit, I mean, the Prime Minister obviously is there as well, and trying to, based on what we just heard from Claire Coutinho, trying to trumpet the UK as a world leader on climate, which might be potentially true based on some statistics, but it doesn't totally tally with some of the alterations in policy of late. How's it going down over there?
Well, he'll certainly be here to reassert the UK's position on net zero and in the COP process. And the Prime Minister's right. Historically, the UK has played a very important leadership role, and we also have been a nation which decarbonised very far, and we started quite a lot earlier than a lot of other countries. However, how does it go down the room? He's talking to an expert crowd here. They can read between the lines, and they know that in terms of emissions, yes, the UK did make some cuts significantly when we phased out coal, but in recent years, we haven't been anywhere near as proactive as some countries. Our own Climate Change Committee is warning the government that it's currently going to miss its immediate climate targets. In a way, some of the statistics the government's rolling out, it's a bit like drawing on the overdraft they've built up in terms of emissions cuts. There are other delegations here that are moving much faster in cutting carbon. There's also how the messaging has gone down. So while the Prime Minister might be here trumpeting his net zero ambition and what the UK is doing, don't forget, to a domestic agenda, he's very much changed his rhetoric around climate change and net zero, talking about how he won't give in to eco-extremists and things like that. That's very much to play to the right-wing element of his own party, a small crowd. But those words echo around the world, and there are people, particularly those from middle-income countries who are struggling to persuade their governments to reach the net zero, who were very unhappy indeed with what the Prime Minister's been saying domestically, because their governments can turn to them and say, well, look, that's the UK's attitude. So his work cut out to try and redress the balance and persuade the people here who are trying to come to consensus on climate change and ambition on cutting emissions, that really is where the UK stands.
Tom Clark, great stuff. Thanks so much for that. And we'll be back out to the COP28 summit throughout the day here on Sky News, but particularly on this show at about 8:10 for the King's opening remarks. Well, still to come, also on the show this morning, testing times on this World AIDS Days. We'll be talking to an activist who's lived with HIV for more than 40 years. Later in the programme, I'll be speaking to another Conservative former Health Secretary, Lord Bethell, about Matt Hancock's COVID inquiry claims from yesterday. Of course, Matt Hancock due to continue his evidence today. And from just after 8, we'll be joined by the Shadow Industry and Decarbonisation Minister, Sarah Jones, for Labour's take on all of the day's news. Now, as mentioned, former Health Secretary Matt Hancock has admitted that despite his assurances, the country's care homes were not fully protected. Our People and Politics correspondent Nick Martin reported from inside some of those care homes in the early days of the pandemic and has now spoken to one care home manager about how she felt hearing the former Health Secretary's evidence at the COVID inquiry yesterday.
Newfield Care Home in Sheffield at the peak of the outbreak.
How are you?
COVID was spreading fast from room to room and residents were dying. Facing accusations that the NHS was being prioritised over the care sector, the then Health Secretary Matt Hancock made this bold claim.
Right from the start, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes.
That claim has haunted Mr Hancock ever since.
Because that's not how it felt in this care home and thousands of others. At the time, I witnessed for myself a lack of PPE, a shortage of tests for staff, and I also saw patients discharged from hospital into care homes without tests.
Giving evidence at the COVID inquiry, Matt Hancock was asked about his claim.
However you describe the protective processes you put in place around the care sector, they did not form an unbroken circle, did they?
It is quite clear from the evidence that Professor Van Tam is right.
You said we absolutely did throw a protective ring around social care.
Care home owner Nicola Richards was crying out for help as early as March 2020.
It's incredibly raw to me to watch that and hear what he's got to say, but we knew that anyway. We knew that at the time, that the words he was saying, they were just empty words. He was standing publicly and saying this when we knew it just wasn't true, it were lies.
What do you want this inquiry to learn to ensure that the same thing doesn't happen again?
I think lessons need to be learned. We should have been given the protection that we absolutely deserved, and for me, they've failed the most vulnerable.
Care homes were promised protection, but in so many cases, it came too late. Thousands of care home residents likely paid for that delay with their lives. Nick Martin, Sky News, Sheffield.
And as mentioned, we will be talking to Lord Bethell shortly to analyse a bit more deeply what was said by Matt Hancock at the COVID inquiry yesterday. Of course, he's due to give more evidence today as well. Time, though, for a quick look at the weather now.
warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
The cold and mostly fine theme will remain with overnight frost, fog and ice, but there'll be a little snow around as well. It should be mostly fine, if frosty now, but there's some low cloud and freezing fog in places, while wintry showers affect exposed coastal areas, and there are some icy stretches likely.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Let's return now to our coverage of the COP28 Climate Summit. Our climate presenter, Tom Heap, is there as well, and he's been having a look at green initiatives in a city, of course, that is often otherwise known for its oil and gas production. Tom, break it down for us.
Of course, that is true. This is a country whose wealth is founded on oil and gas. But in recent times, they do know that the future looks like it might be moving away from that income stream. And they've got the money to invest in a lot of green alternatives. And also, this place draws in smart people from across the world. So we've been out looking at an extraordinarily large solar development on a school, one of the biggest I've ever seen, at 2 megawatts, which is, believe me, a lot. And one of the reasons that solar is so effective in this place is because 70% of the electricity used in the United Arab Emirates goes into air conditioning. So it's a perfect match with when the sun shines. So that's really, really significant. Also, they're saying that even though this is known as a petrostate, 70% of its income actually doesn't come from oil and gas, and they want to make that percentage go down. They still want to drill and sell a lot of oil and gas around the world, but they want to bring that percentage down. We also went out to look at an indoor farm, growing food in the desert with, once again, a lot of high tech, and also looking at waste recycling, because one of the things about an economy like this, which is known, if you like, for its luxury, its excess. Go to the restaurants here, the helpings are extraordinary. There is an awful lot of food waste too, and waste of other products. But they are beginning to get on top of these things. And what all these people told us was that they think there is a change of heart happening here. Well, there is a change of emphasis, let's say. They still want to make money out of oil and gas, but they are realizing the future might not be based there, and they want to be on the right train for the future as well. So they haven't given up the oil and gas horse, but they're definitely backing 2 horses here. One of those is renewables and climate solutions, and that's what my film's about this weekend.
Well, we look forward to that, Tom, as always, on the Climate Show over the weekend, and more, of course, from Tom and the team at the COP Summit throughout the day here as well. As I mentioned already, the King will be making his opening statement at about 8:10 today, and we'll bring that to you live. Also coming up here on Sky News Breakfast, a Thai national who's been held hostage by Hamas in Gaza tells Sky News she feels she's died and been reborn after returning to safety. Testing Times on this World's Aid Day will be talking to an activist who's lived with HIV for more than 40 years. And in sport, we'll find out how Tiger Woods got on in his first competitive round of golf in more than a year. We'll be right back here on Breakfast. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Sky News Breakfast. A Thai national who had been held hostage by Hamas in Gaza has told Sky News she feels like she's died and been reborn after returning to safety with her family. Our Asia correspondent Cordelia Lynch has spoken to one woman and her husband who were captured by Hamas during their October the 7th attack on Israel.
Finally, they are back on Thai soil. 17 hostages, looking subdued and exhausted. After nearly 2 months of captivity, this was a return to a country 35-year-old Yo hasn't seen for more than 4 years. In northeastern Thailand, the final stop. Yo's 8-year-old daughter and mother, full of joy. This, the moment Yo calls a miracle.
This feeling to be back with your family, to be safe again, what is it like?
It's something that I've been waiting for so long. I'm so delighted. I'm so glad. It's like I died and I've been reborn.
What kind of conditions were you living in?
They gave us food and water once a day. They treated us well.
I was asked not to talk about it. There are still images that stick in my head. We were captured together, but then we were kept separately. I didn't know where he was.
Are you angry with Hamas?
In Hamas, there are both good people and bad people. The good treated me well, gave me food so I could survive. They look after us. But there are also the bad people that put me in that situation.
Do you think you'll ever return?
Yes, I want to go back. If there is a chance, I would. I don't want to think about the situation, but I love everybody there. I wish that these two nations could love each other, that there will be no more war.
At home in Kongen, there is now some peace. Elation, too. There is also a lot of trauma, so much unsaid. It is here, though, where Yo feels she can start to heal.
Well, our Asia correspondent Cordelia Lynch does join me now. And Cordelia, those uplifting images that we saw at the end as she was reunited with her family is such a contrasting emotion to what obviously has been experienced on both sides for the last few weeks. And indeed, you had spoken to her mother previously as well.
That's right. There is jeopardy, there is trauma, there is loss on both sides, and everyone is feeling it deeply. Yo also spoke of her love and hope that both sides would somehow find a resolution and could live in peace. She is one of around 30,000 Thai nationals who were working in Israel, largely as farm labourers, and the majority come from here in northeastern Thailand, a poor rice-growing region, and they leave to ultimately seek better opportunities for their families. Yo was sending back around half of her salary every month, about £560, and last night she was celebrating at the home she helped build. They had a celebratory meal of papaya salad and fried pork and sticky rice, a traditional Isan dish, one that she didn't know she'd ever get to enjoy again. Next week, she's going to be taking part in a homecoming ceremony, something Thais traditionally believe helps to bring back a soul that's been spooked by a traumatic event. She's also going to be taking part in a meditation next week as well, and her partner wants to train to become a monk. Their lives have both been irrevocably changed. 23 Thais have now been freed, but 9 remain in captivity. And with an end to this temporary truce, there is a lot of jeopardy for those 9 people.
Just additionally, Cordelia, I just want to dwell on that one point that we heard and you mentioned at the top, that she made it very clear who she felt were the bad guys in all of this. But also, and commending her for it, was not talking about retribution, but a hope for peace, ultimately.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, actually, she was very clear to point out that many of those holding them captive, some treated them well. And she wanted to acknowledge that, as too did her partner. I think they have found themselves as Thai nationals in the centre of a conflict that they are not a part of, but they are seeing a mix of communities in that border area where so many of them were living, and they don't feel they have a stake or an opinion about the conflict other than they would like to see resolution on both sides.
Cordelia, thanks so much. Now, it is World AIDS Day, and here in the UK, the government says more gay, bisexual and MSM men were tested for HIV last year than ever before. But there are still inequalities in relation to race and gender. Women are least likely to be offered an HIV test and most likely to decline one when offered. The UK's HIV action plan seeks to reduce infection by 2025. Well, let's speak about that with Jonathan Blake, who's one of the longest living people in the UK with HIV. He was diagnosed back in 1982. Jonathan, very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. If I may, just to set the scene, I wanted to take you back to the early 1980s when you were diagnosed. And I just wonder how terrifying a piece of information that was to receive back then in, was it 1981?
1982, October 1982. It was terrifying. It basically was a death sentence. I was told that I had between 3 and 9 months to live. I was 33. They ended it by saying, there will, of course, be palliative care. But at 33, you don't want to hear that.
What was your feeling inside?
Oh, I mean, I was completely kind of winded, absolutely winded. And I really didn't know what I was going to do. I'd been waiting for 2 days for the results from the biopsy that they did. And then when you get that kind of thing, it's unbelievable.
Well, I mean, you're focusing very much on the health implications, it sounds like, but was there also an awful stigma attached to it as well?
Oh, there was a huge stigma. And I mean, what is interesting is that actually the stigma became bigger with the government's 1987, Don't Die of Ignorance campaign, because it was so based on fear. And one has to remember, of course, that we didn't have mobile phones or computers. So to get the information out was very difficult.
And back then in the 80s, on the health side of things, what were you offered and what was available? And are you encouraged about what is available today?
Oh, I mean, it's chalk and cheese. I mean, there was nothing. They did eventually... there was a trial called the Concord trial where they tried AZT. Well, it turned out that AZT was a veiled chemotherapy drug, and actually it worked for 3 months and then it didn't. But as old chemotherapy drugs worked, they wipe out your whole immune system. So everybody who was on that trial lost their immune system, and most of them died. I mean, it was terrifying.
I know there's more that you'd like to be seen done, and I'm interested that you could touch on that. I know you've done a lot yourself, and I wanted to commend you on that work. And because we're sort of running out of time, I just wonder whether often we should never take our foot off the gas to try and make further progress. But is this also one of the areas, and the praise is directed at you and your colleagues as well on this, where actually we can now step back and say, we've really made great progress, or not yet?
No. I mean, I don't think that we can step back. I mean, the most important thing, I think, for everybody is to test. You know, with COVID, we tested regularly, but nobody does it with HIV.
No.
And the tests are there, and if you know your status, then you can get the medication. With being on the medication, if your viral load is so low that it becomes undetectable, you cannot pass that virus. So those are really important things.
Well, Jonathan, we're really grateful for you coming in on World HIV Day, AIDS Day, and thank you for all the work you do on every other day of the year. And it's great to see you so well and here with us this morning. Jonathan Blake. Now, next time you post a letter or Christmas card, you could be in for a festive surprise from a singing postbox. 4 special red and golden postboxes decorated with snowmen, snowflakes and stars play a festive tune such as Jingle Bells and Deck the Halls when you drop a letter through the slot. Royal Mail has installed the singing boxes in London, Swansea, Glasgow and Belfast to encourage people to keep posting letters this Christmas. I love that. I love Christmas music. I love Christmas. I still like to post an actual letter as well. So win-win-win on that.
Do you still write Christmas cards though? That's the key, isn't it? Because you have to write the Christmas card to get
I feel like I almost might again soon with a baby boy to share pictures of.
You can do one of those little cute
But
cards
no,
of the
too
family.
busy.
Too busy, yeah. Maybe not this year.
Anyway,
maybe next year.
Sports time.
It is sports time. It was a really difficult night last night. Not for the players so much, Aston Villa, but for the police. I think they saw it coming, but it was still pretty bad when it happened. Let's have a look.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
John, welcome to Old Trafford.
Thanks very much.
You're a man of many talents, but we're interested in you today for one major reason.
Okay.
Season ticket holder at Manchester United, and you told me you're in the where?
I believe I'm in the E of Manchester towards the back of that bottom tier there. Every time I sort of do a job or sign on to something, I always think, well, at least that's my season tickets secured for another season. It's always my priority. Yeah, I'd hate to be without it.
And you have any recollection of that, the first time you actually walked through the steps or the pitch, saw the players?
Oh, I just couldn't believe it. I've got very, very clear memories of that game. It was New Year's Day, 2003, and we played Sunderland at Old Trafford, and it was kind of the perfect first game to go to, really. That was in the era when we had Scholesy starting, and we had Beckham starting, we had Coutinho starting, and I just couldn't believe that I was seeing them all of a sudden.
So this is David Beckham asking you for a picture. Look how happy he is to be posing with you.
I know. and the weird thing about it was that, David Beckham's not somebody who maintains a look for very long. I don't know how long he kept that for, but I remember the first time I saw him, on this pitch down there, was his sort of 2003 long blonde hair phase. So the fact that when I met him, he had a similar look going on. It was just like he'd walked out. He was like he'd walked off my bedroom wall. And then the cutest thing was, probably about a year later, I met Brooklyn at a thing, and I said to him, "Oh, I met your dad about a year ago," and he said, "Yeah, he told me." I was like, "No way!" This is a picture taken up there of me and my dad in the first game that was allowed full capacity after COVID. It was against Leeds. It was the opening day of the 21-22 season. And yeah, there was just something about that day where there were times during the lockdown where we didn't know if it was ever going to happen again. There are times when, if your parents are getting a bit older, you don't know what you're going to do with them again. You know what I mean? You don't know if you'll ever share moments like that again. So there was something about getting back in this stadium with a full crowd against Leeds as well, of all teams.
Yeah.
There was something about it that just felt magic.
Tell me about the other players that are huge Game of Thrones fans who are delighted to have you in their contact book.
My closest friend out of everybody, sadly, I'm going to say sadly no longer with us, but he's still alive. But he's just not. Was David De Gea. He was a big Game of Thrones fan, and we texted on birthday. We still do sort of text on birthdays and whenever there's some.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Jackie, thank you very much for the sport there. Well, still to come here on Sky News at breakfast, we will be talking to the former Conservative Health Minister, Lord Bethell, about his thoughts on Matt Hancock's performance at the COVID inquiry.
Street Child is about every child in the world being safe in school and learning. We focus our efforts in the world's war-torn and poorest countries. And look, it's a cause we just ask everyone to get behind. We know that without education, life's opportunities are incredibly narrow. But if you get just little education, everything is possible. With a bit of imagination about the future for the children you're seeing, the actions we take now can affect their 5, 10, 25-year view, and that's what we're about. There are 70 million children in the world of primary school going age who are not in school. So you could fill the entire of the British Islands with children who should go to school, just for primary school, and they're not. So there's a huge amount to be done. We began 15 years ago with one project for 100 children in a town called Makeni, in the north of Sierra Leone. We've just gone past the point where we've made an impact on the education of 1 million children.
Wow.
So a lot can be done. In Ukraine, we've been repairing schools that have been destroyed by conflict. We have been running sports sessions. The Times ran a piece over the weekend about football classes we're running. One of the things Street Child does is we partner with local organisations, and so we know wherever there's anywhere in the world, I think of a community there'll be great local charities. If something terrible happened there, these are the people I reckon that you would trust the most to come in and make a difference. But where would they get the money from? So we come in, I get to do interviews like this, people get to hear about Street Child, and we collect the funds and we channel them through to those local organisations in places like Ukraine. So we support about 40 organisations in Ukraine, running football programmes, repairing schools, running play classes for traumatised children.
How many kids do you think you've helped?
In Ukraine?
Generally?
Yeah, well, generally it's 1.1 million at this stage, directly, and with the opportunity to be safe in school and learning.
Welcome back. Well, yesterday, Matt Hancock admitted to the COVID inquiry that the government did not throw a protective ring around care homes like it said it did. He also accused former advisor Dominic Cummings of creating a culture of fear. Well, today his evidence session continues. Joining me now ahead of that, another Conservative former Health Secretary, Lord Bethell. Lord Bethell, thanks so much for joining us. Very good morning to you.
Good morning, Wilf.
I want to start with the big pitch thing, which I think came out from the first few hours of Matt Hancock's testimony yesterday, which was this idea that in the early months of 2020, January and February in particular, his department, your department, the Health Department, was pushing much harder to deal in general with the pandemic, not getting to the specifics of what was being advised or not, than the centre of government, and that the centre of government, the COBRA mechanism in particular, was very slow to respond. Do you think that's a fair summation?
That was exactly what my sensation was. Listen, we weren't certain that the pandemic was coming our way, but we knew there was a very strong chance that it might, and all the evidence we got increased those probabilities. And during that time, it was very difficult to get any attention from Downing Street or the Cabinet Office. And instead of springing into action and asking us how they could help, we were really signalled very, very clearly, could you please go away, leave your pandemic out of things and just calm down. And that was, on reflection, a very big mistake.
The other big contentious issue yesterday was this claim that on the 13th of March, Matt Hancock says he told the Prime Minister explicitly that we should have an immediate lockdown. Dominic Cummings immediately tweeted as that was happening and said that this is absolutely rubbish. What's your take on that particular dispute?
Well, Dominic Cummings is wrong. He wasn't on the telephone call with the Prime Minister, and all the collateral evidence points very, very clearly to a much clearer sense of urgency in the department than we could elicit from either the Prime Minister or from the Cabinet Office. But I don't like the blame game too much. The idea that one person made the wrong call on one day is not the reason why we're having this inquiry. We're having it because the whole country wasn't in the correct state to be prepared for this horrible emergency.
I definitely want to come back to whether this inquiry is achieving its goals or not in a moment. But so on this 13th of March question, next week Boris Johnson is giving evidence. Do you think he'll say Matt Hancock was right, this was raised in this phone call?
Well, I can't answer for Boris. Boris has been very straight shooting. He has been basically complimentary about Matt Hancock. They had a good working relationship. They spoke many times every day. And the point of friction is not really between Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson. It is a larger issue between that toxic culture in number 10 and parts of the Cabinet Office that was really what I think the Secretary of State for Health was pointing at.
So stepping back to your earlier point about this inquiry in general, I mean, you've been in government, you know how decisions are made, and everyone's got to be ready for an inquiry after the fact to learn lessons from it. I wonder whether also now ministers are going to be terrified to make decisions about anything because of the scale of the way that everything has become evidence in this. You know, it's not just WhatsApp messages, which presumably no one wants to conduct business by going forward, which maybe is a good thing, but it might also slow things down. But end-of-evening personal notes and thoughts, is that fair to government ministers, do you think, or not?
Well,
is it constructive?
You've got a good point. I remember very early, like in mid-January, when we had an update from Chris Whitty, he left the room and one of the special advisors said, oh, and by the way, there's going to be an inquiry like in Iraq. And we all thought, you know, the penny dropped about the massive scale of what we were approaching, but also within all of our minds through the next years that every interaction we had would be very heavily scrutinised, and we deported ourselves accordingly. And I'm very surprised to see this material from Downing Street and the Cabinet Office. Didn't they realise that we were going to be going through all of this stuff? But you are right. I have had to surrender my personal emails, my telephone. The Department for Health has a copy of my entire telephone, including all of my family pictures and my medical details, all of my WhatsApps, absolutely everything. And that did come as a bit of a surprise. I thought that there were some private spaces, but that clearly we've got beyond that point.
Well, Lord Beth, thanks for joining us this morning. And Matt Hancock's testimony continues. And Boris Johnson next week, so perhaps we'll continue the conversation in due course. Thanks so much. Time for a quick look at the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
The cold and mostly fine theme will remain with overnight frost, fog and ice, but there'll be a little snow around as well. It's mostly fine, if frosty now, but there's some low cloud and freezing fog in places, while wintry showers affect exposed coasts. Icy stretches are also likely. That's the weather.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, as we were mentioning there, it's expected to see very cold temperatures over the next couple of days. -10 in parts of the country, and snow's been falling overnight in some areas. And Joe Robinson, our meteorologist, is here on set to tell us much more about this, because you're the expert and I'm certainly not. What are we expecting?
Yeah, it's been cold. I mean, last night was we got down to -9.4 degrees Celsius in Cumbria. That's the coldest night since March. So very cold start for many places. And we've seen snow showers across eastern parts, covering in northeast England, even as far south as Ipswich, seeing a dusting of snow this morning.
And where's this coming from, and thus where's it sort of heading? Is it going to stick around for a while?
To be fair, most of us, it's dry, it's sunny. sunny. That's what we're going to see today. It'll be cold, but most places will be dry and sunny. But those showers are mainly in the east today, just eastern fringes of the UK. But some western parts might see a few wintry showers as well.
Jeff, great stuff. Thanks very much. Come back again next hour with a bit more detail. This is going to be unbelievably cold in the next day or so. Right, coming up next on Sky News Breakfast, we'll be back live at the COP summit ahead of the King's speech. Hello, good morning, and everyone. It is 8 o'clock. This is Sky News Breakfast. And as the King prepares to take the stage at the UN's climate summit in Dubai, back home, he's being named in unsubstantiated claims as one of the royals who questioned the colour of his grandson's skin. The Energy Secretary Claire Coutinho told this programme that the UK is enormously far ahead in achieving its climate goals. But will the shadow Decarbonisation Secretary agree? We'll speak to Sarah Jones in just a little bit. It is Friday, the 1st of December, also coming up.
Live in Dubai, where the King is about to address delegates at the largest climate summit there's ever been.
The Israeli military says that it has resumed combat operations in Gaza after a truce between Israel and Hamas expired this morning.
Buckingham Palace is considering all options after the King and the Princess of Wales have been named in unsubstantiated claims as the royals who questioned what skin colour Harry and Meghan's unborn son would have. Former Health Secretary Matt Hancock has admitted that despite his assurances, the country's care homes were not fully protected ahead of the second part of his session at the COVID inquiry. Snow continues to blanket parts of the country, with temperatures expected to drop as low as -10 and yellow weather warnings still in place.
And in sport, police make 39 arrests outside Villa Park, with 4 officers injured in clashes with Legia Warsaw fans. Elsewhere in Europe, Liverpool, Brighton and West Ham secure their places in the knockout stages of the Europa League.
A very good morning to you. The King and the Prime Minister are in Dubai for COP28, where the King's expected to tell world leaders that the hope of the world rests on decisions taken by them at the UN summit. The Prime Minister has been speaking to reporters in Dubai ahead of COP28. He was asked who he meant when he said he was not in hock to ideological zealots over climate change. Here's his response.
Perhaps the people protesting outside my house most recently, but there are people who think that we should get to net zero without any regard to the cost on ordinary families. I don't think that's right. I think we've got to be cognizant of the impact of this on ordinary families up and down the country. We have got an incredible track record in decarbonising in the UK, faster than any other major economy. We should be really proud of that, and I'll be proud of that record at my meetings later today. So we can get to net zero, but we can do so in a more realistic, proportionate way.
Well, our science and technology editor Tom Clark is at the COP conference for us now, and the Prime Minister insisting that the UK is a leader on this, and of course still getting questions about, at the very least, tinkering his climate policy, perhaps he'd say rationalising it. But how are those changes to the policy going down over there?
You know, I think no one would disagree with the Prime Minister when he says we don't want to unnecessarily burden people with the costs of shifting to net zero. I've never heard any government suggest that they would deliberately do that. That's what smart climate change policies are all about. That's what, you know, maybe up to 100,000 people have come here to Dubai to try and sort out. How do we transition the world to a cleaner, greener future without, you know, crippling economies, without making the situation worse than it will be with a hotter planet? Where it becomes difficult, it's not what Rishi Sunak has said, it's the language he's used to say it. It's the tonal shift in his narrative around net zero that has really alarmed some people at summits like this one. Because, as he says, quite rightly, the UK has been a real leader on climate change so far, not just in diplomacy with the actions like our King, who is obviously very much an environmentalist and a powerful diplomatic leader, but also the UK government has always pushed other countries to do more, and we've set, you know, a strong agenda by decarbonising our own economy. But if you start changing the language, make it sound like maybe you're less keen, and let's remember Rishi Sunak's mainly talking to the right wing of his own party when he says things like that. That's the political readout at least. Those words have ramifications, they echo around the world. And if you're a middle-sized country trying to persuade your government to give up burning coal maybe and invest in more renewables, and they can turn around and say, well, look, listen to what the UK is saying on this issue right now, it doesn't help. And that gets noticed. So I think the Prime Minister has got his work cut out here to try and re-establish the UK's leadership on this issue from a diplomatic point of view.
Tom, very quickly, is there genuine focus on what the King has to say? Is he heralded somewhat by the crowd there?
Do you know what? I would speculate that, yes, there is. This also, the UAE is a monarchy. It has close ties with the UK. He is a head of state, and I think people will be interested to hear that. And I think when you hear the words in his speech, I think he'll say some things that a lot of people coming here need to be reminded of in terms of their responsibility towards the environment.
Tom, great stuff. Thanks so much for us. You saw on the split screen there part of the opening ceremony, which is ongoing. It started moments ago. The King is expected early in proceedings. I think second or third. We'll pivot back to COP when he does take to the stage, expected in about 10 minutes' time. Now, the fragile truce between Israel and Hamas has expired. Sirens have been heard over Gaza and southern Israel, and Israel's defense forces say they've resumed combat in Gaza. Well, speaking in the last few minutes, the Prime Minister says he will issue renewed calls for sustained humanitarian pauses during his visit to the Middle East. Our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle joins me now from Jerusalem. Ali, we spoke last hour about how there was some inevitability that this day would be reached at some point. Talk us through that again, but also, in light of what the Prime Minister said, whether there is hope of restarting another kind of pause, given that this has broken down now.
Yes, so firstly, I think that the longer the truce went on and the more times it was extended, I think the closer we got to fighting resuming. And the Israelis had been very clear throughout. It was always their intention to resume the war because they have unfinished business there. They still have to degrade Hamas's military capabilities further. They still need to capture or kill senior Hamas leadership. So the Israelis were always going to get back to the fighting. It was just a question of when. And as each new release of hostages happened, so the number of women and children left in Gaza, hostages, reduced in number. So then you start to look to different categories of people that can be negotiated on. And I think Hamas was starting to demand perhaps more for young men, for example. Certainly if there was any conversation about releasing IDF soldiers, then Hamas would have wanted to extract a big price for that. And so, yeah, I do think it was inevitable that at some stage this truce would break. Having said that, there are negotiations still going on behind the scenes. There are still 150, 160 hostages inside Gaza, and they need to be got out of there. And so I think the negotiations will continue. So it wouldn't be a complete surprise if we see a day, 2 days, 3 days of fighting, only to have another hostage release deal agreed between the two sides at some point.
And Ali, in terms of the other kind of key part, of course, of the deal that we've had over the last few days was aid. What's the latest on that? Does no further aid get in the same way that no further hostages are going to be exchanged? Or is it possible that part of it could continue?
I mean, my honest answer is I don't know, and we're going to have to wait and see. But you're right to point out that the expansion of aid getting into Gaza was a part of the truce deal. So there is a logic that if the truce deal has now collapsed, then that element of it will also cease to happen. But this is humanitarian aid we're talking about, and the pressure is really heavy on Israel to make sure that the humanitarian aid can get into Gaza. So I wouldn't be surprised if that is still allowed to continue. Then, you know, we're seeing somewhere like between 200, 220 trucks a day going into Gaza, going into the south. Of course, it'll be much harder to distribute aid if the fighting has resumed, and there's already been some airstrikes on the southern city of Khan-Yunis. But I think the pressure will be there to make sure that the Israelis still allow it to go in.
Alistair Bunkle, as always, thanks so much, and we'll be back with Ali and the team in Jerusalem throughout the day as the truce does break down. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines this morning. And rail passengers are being warned to expect disruption over the next week because of train driver strikes in their long-running dispute over pay. Members of the ASLEF union at 16 operating companies will strike from tomorrow until Friday, the 8th of December. Of course, that does come on a week when there was good news with the RMT union finding a deal, or at least recommending a deal to its members that it made with the government. The Culture Secretary has launched an investigation into the takeover of the Daily Telegraph by an Abu Dhabi-based fund. Sky News understands Lucy Fraser tasked the Competition and Markets Authority with examining the jurisdictional and competition matters, and tasked Ofcom with looking at the need for accurate presentation of news. Both regulators must report back by the 26th of January. The number of children in temporary accommodation in England facing homelessness this Christmas has hit record highs. Government statistics on homelessness show almost 139,000 children were living in temporary lodgings between April and June this year, a 10.5% increase compared with the end of June last year. Now, King and Kate in race row. That's the headline on the Daily Mirror this morning. The fallout following the release of Omid Scobie's book, of course, after the King and the Princess of Wales were named as the senior royals who questioned what skin colour Prince Archie would have. Keep calm and carry on is the headline in the Metro. The Daily Express going with, if it's an injustice to name the royals in race row, asking that question, as you can see. The Mail says that Scobie's defence is unravelling as he denies ever naming the royals. They say they've spoken to someone within the Dutch distribution of the book. And the Telegraph says the palace are to look at legal action over the claim of being named as racist royals. As we just said, they are considering all options. Buckingham Palace are, after the King and the Princess of Wales were named in those unsubstantiated claims as the senior royals who may have questioned what skin colour Harry and Meghan's unborn son would have a couple of years ago. Well, with me now is our correspondent, Milena Veselinovic. And Milena, I mean, we just see the extent to which this is grabbing the front pages and, of course, comes as the King is about to give his speech at the COP summit. Perhaps most interesting this morning is the vague suggestion by the palace that they might even be considering legal action.
Yes, and that would be completely extraordinary, not only because we haven't really seen the royals do anything like that before, but also against who this legal action would be. Of course, Omid Scobie, the author of this book, he says he has not spoken to either Harry or Meghan, but he also co-authored their book, well, not their book, a book about their split from the royal family, for which he also said he hadn't spoken to them, but it emerged later as part of a legal action that Harry and Meghan's aides did actually brief him and his co-author. So it raises so many questions as to who this legal action would be directed towards, and it would be incredibly extraordinary to see an action like that mounted by the British royal family. But it does remain a very odd situation. The journalist Omid Scobie saying that he never submitted a text with the names of these senior royals in it, but saying that their names were common knowledge among Fleet Street reporters. He also said that it was the UK laws that were preventing him from including their names in the manuscript. The Dutch publishers now pulled this book, saying it was an error. It's being reprinted. We don't really know what exactly happened here. It's a bit of a mystery. But what it is doing is drawing attention from what the royal family would like us to focus on, which is the speech by the King at COP28, environmental summit, something very close to his heart. He has not publicly commented on it. We don't expect him to either. We really know that what he wants all of us to focus is on the words that he's about to say at the summit.
Elena, great stuff. Thanks so much. And we will join the summit live when the King does take to the stage, expected in the next few moments or so. But firstly, let's explore these topics a little more deeply. And earlier I spoke to the Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary Claire Coutinho about how fast the UK government is working on climate goals.
The UK is enormously far ahead, and I don't think anyone disagrees with the fact that we need to be very logical and hard-headed about this, because this is a practical problem. There's no winning in being ideological about it. You've got to think these things through very carefully, which is why in recent weeks you've seen us make these decisions, which is to protect household finances, to shield UK households from the worst costs of net zero.
Claire Coutinho earlier on the show. Well, I'm joined now by the Shadow Minister for Industry and Decarbonisation, Labour's Sarah Jones. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms Jones. Good morning to you. I'm interested in your take about how critical COP28 is for the future of our country, for the future of the planet.
I think COP is incredibly important, and it's great that our King is there and about to speak. I think it's the third time he's done that. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, is in COP with David Lammy and Ed Miliband because we think this is a really crucial opportunity to do a number of things, really. Of course, to tackle the climate crisis, and this is the opportunity for the world leaders to come together and talk about how we can do that. But for the UK, it's also about grabbing the opportunities to invest and to create good jobs and to bring bills down. So it's really important for a number of reasons, and I'm really pleased that Keir Starmer is there meeting investors today to talk about how we can encourage people to be investing in the UK to develop the renewable energy that will bring those costs down on our bills, which have been so sky high, and develop the good jobs around the whole of the country that we think we can kickstart with the policies that Labour have got for a next government.
I think everyone can agree that this topic and the environment is a critical one for the long-term future of the country, and that affects us all, whatever your political persuasion. And I think it's been quite encouraging to see Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak joining forces almost, or perhaps at least not conflicting each other when it comes to some of the other international issues of late, from Russia and Ukraine to Israel and Hamas. On this topic, is Sir Keir Starmer there to cause a headache for the Prime Minister and try and expose differences between the two men and the two parties, or is it also in consort to support the Prime Minister on a common goal?
So I think Keir Starmer is there to show that under a Labour government, Britain will be back on the world stage. We have seen Rishi Sunak step back from some of the commitments that he'd made in this space, which is bad for the climate, but it's also bad for business and investment in the UK, because people don't know whether he's coming or going. So Keir is there to talk to world leaders, to talk to business, and to talk to people about what a Labour government would do. We think Rishi Sunak has made the wrong call on his backtracking when it comes to climate commitments, and we want to set out what a Labour government would do, which is to grab the opportunities of the future of the renewable sector and of greening our economy, because that means cheaper bills for everybody and it means good jobs.
We just put up a split screen, Sarah. The King is expected to take to the stage any moment now. I think he's about to be introduced. Do you feel sorry for him ahead of this speech, that he's having to field questions, maybe not directly, but front pages of headlines? We just ran through them with our reporter that raise this question again as to whether he's ever expressed questions that bring up race and things like that.
Well, it's a private issue that's playing out publicly, and that has been the case, I suspect, throughout his entire life. This is the third time that he's been at COP speaking. That's really important. He's shown real leadership on this agenda. I've spent time with him on knife crime, which he takes a real interest in. He did a big summit that I went to where he was trying to work out how he could help and how we could bring levels of crime down. This is a king that takes an interest in lots of different issues and wants to do the best for his country. And I'm sure he'll give a brilliant speech any minute now.
And do you think he and the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, get on very well, and that Keir Starmer backs him unequivocally?
I'm sure they get on very well. I think they have joint agendas when it comes to tackling the climate crisis and hoping for the best for our country and to grab all the opportunities that come with that.
I wanted to get Labour's view as well on the fact that fighting's restarted this morning as the truce broke down in Israel and Gaza. Sir Keir Starmer's been fairly resolute, despite pressure from within his party, about exactly what should have been pushed for when fighting was ongoing initially. What's Labour's take now that the truce is broken down again?
Well, mediation was sadly going on until the very last minute, and it failed, and we are seeing the resuming of fighting. What we would urge is that all sides don't squander the progress that has been made, and we want to work towards a return to the cessation of violence. We saw in that period of time aid getting in to Gaza. We saw the release of hostages. Israel has to be sure that Hamas can't do what it did again on the 7th of November. And the Palestinians have to be sure that they have a future in a country that we can build. And those things need to happen. But we would just urge people not to squander the progress that had been made, because too many people are losing their lives. And we want people to work as hard as possible to see a new cessation of violence.
Sarah Jones, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's pivot back to the COP28 summit now. As we mentioned, the King due to take to the stage in just a moment. You can see on the split screen there the preview. It's sometimes looking like a dark screen. It's quite a sort of dark promotional video, it seems. But that is the live shot, and the King is not on the stage yet. Our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, is at his stage at the COP28 summit. And Tom, as we wait for this speech, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I mean, is the King, is our head of state overshadowing our head of government at this gathering?
I don't know if it's about overshadowing. I mean, I remember he's here to, I suppose it wouldn't be unfair to say, he's like a warm-up act. He's here to get people thinking about the really big picture, to try and ground the people who've come here really with line-by-line detail in their minds about specific texts and negotiations and Cartagena protocols or whatever you might be negotiating, to remember why they're all coming here. In a monarchy like the United Arab Emirates, obviously another monarch held some sway, and he can persuade people to align with his way of thinking about the environment. Now, in a way, he's preaching to the choir. People have come to this summit because they care about the climate. But on the tougher agenda, for example, the real thing to play for here, which is greater ambition, more commitment, more direction on how we're going to cut emissions, you do need someone to kind of cheerlead and focus the minds. Because remember, Rishi Sunak did a slightly different job, and that's hold bilateral talks with other nations to show how much, in terms of real money, we are committing to the net zero agenda, to try and persuade others to do more, and also what happens at these summits, and they are confusing and complicated, and that probably explains why we still haven't seen the King on the stage, because I do tend to overrun, because it's like herding cats, and negotiators are like that. There are lots of little talks going on behind the scenes. Various things can be traded between nations in terms of deals and things that have nothing to do with fossil fuels necessarily, or cutting emissions, to try and further objectives and progress at these talks. So Rishi Sunak is playing a very different role. But like we were saying earlier, he also does have a job on his hands to try and reassert the UK's leadership or role as a leader in net zero ambition.
Tom, great stuff. We are going to actually go live now, back to the main stage, because about to give his remarks and then introduce the King is Antonio Guterres. Let's listen.
For the wonderful hospitality that we are enjoying in Dubai from the government and the people of the United Arab Emirates. COP28 President Dr. Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, I want to congratulate you on the positive start of the COP, with an expeditious approval of the agenda and the landmark operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. Congratulations. Your Majesties, Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, friends, all protocol observed. Just days ago, I was on the melting ice of Antarctica. Not long before, I was among the melting glaciers of Nepal. These two spots are far in distance, but united in crisis. Polar ice and glaciers are vanishing before our eyes, causing havoc the world over, from landslides and floods to rising seas. But this is just one symptom of the sickness bringing our climate to its knees. A sickness only you, global leaders, can cure. Excellencies, Earth's vital signs are failing. Record emissions, ferocious fires, deadly droughts, and the hottest year ever. We can guarantee it even we are still in November. We are miles from the goals of the Paris Agreement and minutes to midnight for the 1.5 degree limit. But it is not too late. We can, you can prevent planetary crash and burn. We have the technologies to avoid the worst of climate chaos if we act now. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has charted a clear path to the 1.5 degree world. But we need leadership, cooperation, and political will for action, and we need it now. It's true, our world is unequal and divided. As we see in this region, conflicts are causing immense suffering and intense emotion. We just had the news that the bombs are sounding again in Gaza. And climate chaos is fanning the flames of injustice. Global heating is busting budgets, ballooning food prices, upending energy markets, and feeding a cost of living crisis. But climate action can flip the switch. And renewable energy is the gift that keeps on giving. It's good for our planet, our health, and our economies, cleaning our air, meeting the world's growing energy demand, connecting millions of people to affordable electricity, bringing stability and security to markets, and saving money, as renewable energy has never been cheaper. Excellencies, friends, the diagnosis is clear. The success of the COP depends on the global stocktake prescribing a credible cure in 3 areas. First, drastically cutting emissions. Current policies would lead to an earth-scorching 3-degree temperature rise. So the global stocktake must set clear expectations for economy-wide national determined contributions presented by all countries that cover all greenhouse gases and align with 1.5-degree limits. The G20, which represents 80% of the world's emissions, must lead. And I urge countries to speed up their net zero timelines to get there as close as possible to 2040 in developed countries and 2050 in emerging economies. Second, we cannot save a burning planet via fire holes of fossil fuels. We must accelerate a just, equitable transition to renewables. The science is clear. The 1.5-degree limit is only possible if we ultimately stop burning all fossil fuels. Not reduce, not abate, phase out with a clear time frame aligned with 1.5 degrees. And the global stocktake must not only commit to that, it must also commit to triple renewables, double energy efficiency, and bring clean energy to all by 2030. The economics are clear. The global shift to renewables is inevitable. The only question is how much heating our planet will endure before it happens. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is recommending ending our addiction to coal by 2030 in OECD countries and 2040 for the rest of the world. At the same time, according to the International Energy Agency, the oil and gas industry accounts for just 1% of clean energy investments. So allow me to have a message for fossil fuel company leaders. Your old world is rapidly aging. Do not double down on an obsolete business model. Lead the transition to renewables using the resources you have available. Make no mistake, the road to climate sustainability is also the only viable pathway to economic sustainability of your companies in the future. And I urge governments to help industry make the right choice by regulating, legislating, putting a fair price on carbon, ending fossil fuel subsidies, and adopting a windfall tax on profits. Excellencies, third, climate justice is long overdue. Developing countries are being devastated by disasters they did not cause. Extortionate borrowing costs are blocking their climate action plans, and support is far too little, far too late. The global stocktake must commit to a surge in finance, including for adaptation and loss and damage. And it must support reform of the multilateral development banks to leverage far more private finance at reasonable costs for developing countries in climate action. And developed countries must show how they will double adaptation finance to $40 billion a year by 2025, as promised, and clarify how they are delivering on the $100 billion as promised. Excellencies, the climate challenge is not just another issue in your inbox. Protecting our climate is the world's greatest test of leadership. And so I urge you to lead. Humanity's fate hangs in the balance. Make this COP count. Make this COP a game changer. Make this COP the renewal hope in the future of humankind. Thank you.
The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres there
Thank
saying
you,
we are
Mr.
miles
Secretary
from the
General.
goals of the
Ladies and
Paris
gentlemen,
agreement. He was
it is
urging
time
all
for us
world leaders
to turn
there,
ambition
that
into
are in
action,
attendance to make
share
this
insight
COP a
on how
game
to move
changer.
forward
Of
together.
course,
Please
great fact it is
welcome a true
COP28
champion of the
highlights
environment. His
that
Majesty,
the hopes of it being
King
the
Charles
game changer
III.
perhaps should be lowered a little bit, something that, of course, has been brought up in the build-up to this summit. And as you heard there, the next speaker to be introduced is the King Charles. Let's go live and listen to his opening remarks for this COP28 summit.
Your Highness, Secretary General, Your Majesties, Your Royal Highnesses, Presidents, Prime Ministers, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan for his warm invitation to speak to you at the opening of COP28. 8 years ago, I was most touched to be asked to speak at the opening of COP21 in Paris, which of course culminated in the Paris Agreement, a landmark moment of hope and optimism when nations put differences to one side for the common good. I pray with all my heart that COP28 will be another critical turning point towards genuine transformational action at a time when already, as scientists have been warning for so long, we are seeing alarming tipping points being reached. I've spent a large proportion of my life trying to warn of the existential threats facing us over global warming, over climate change and biodiversity loss. But I was not alone. For instance, Sheikh Mohammed's dear father, Sheikh Zayed, was advocating for clean energy at a time even before the United Arab Emirates as such came into being. All these decades later, and despite all the attention, there is 30% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now than there was back then, and almost 40% more methane. Some important progress has been made, but it worries me greatly that we remain so dreadfully far off track, as the Global Stocktake report demonstrates so graphically. The dangers are no longer distant risks. I have seen across the Commonwealth and beyond countless communities which are unable to withstand repeated shocks, whose lives and livelihoods are laid waste by climate change. Surely, real action is required to stem the growing toll of its most vulnerable victims. Repeated cyclones batter vulnerable island nations like Vanuatu and Dominica. India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan have been experiencing unprecedented floods, and East Africa is suffering a decades-long drought. This past summer, in common with Spain, Greece, the United States, and many other countries, Canada experienced its most severe wildfire season on record, with 18.5 million hectares of land burned, causing terrible loss of life and property, and of course, releasing enormous amounts of greenhouse gases that contribute to dangerous feedback loops to which climate scientists have been alerting us for decades. As I've tried to say on many occasions, unless we rapidly repair and restore nature's unique economy based on harmony and balance, which is our ultimate sustainer, our own economy and survivability will be imperiled. Records are now being broken so often that we are perhaps becoming immune to what they are really telling us. When we see the news that this last Northern Hemisphere summer, for instance, was the warmest global average temperature on record, we need to pause to process what this actually means. We are taking the natural world outside balanced norms and limits and into dangerous, uncharted territory. We are carrying out a vast, frightening experiment of changing every ecological condition all at once, at a pace that far outstrips nature's ability to cope. As we work towards a zero-carbon future, we must work equally towards being nature positive. With what we are witnessing, our choice now is a starker and darker one. How dangerous are we actually prepared to make our world? Dealing with this is a job for us all. Change will come by working together and making it easier to embrace decisions that will sustain our world, rather than carry on as though there are no limits or as though our actions have no consequences. As you gather, ladies and gentlemen, for these critical negotiations, the hope of the world rests on the decisions you must take. I can only encourage you to consider some practical questions which might inform the task ahead of you. Firstly, how can our multilateral organizations, which were established at a different time for different challenges, be strengthened for the crisis we face? How can we bring together our public, private, philanthropic and NGO sectors ever more effectively so that they all play their part in delivering climate action, each complementing the unique strengths of the others? Public finance alone will never be sufficient, but with the private sector firmly at the table and a better, fairer international financial system, combined with the innovative use of risk reduction tools like first loss risk guarantees, we could mobilize the trillions of dollars we need, in the order of $4.5 to $5 trillion a year, to drive the transformation we need. Secondly, how can we ensure that finance flows to those developments most essential to a sustainable future and away from practices that make our world more dangerous across every industry in every part of the world? I have, for instance, been heartened by some of the steps taken by parts of the insurance sector, which plays such a vital role in incentivizing more sustainable approaches and providing an invaluable source of investment to reduce the risks we face. Thirdly, how can we accelerate innovation and the deployment of renewable energy, of clean technology and other green alternatives to move decisively towards investment in this vital transition across all industries? For instance, how can we increase investments in regenerative agriculture, which can be a nature-positive carbon sink? What incentives are necessary? And how can those which have a perverse impact be eliminated with all due speed? Fourthly, how can we bring together different solutions and initiatives to ensure coherent, long-term approaches across sectors, countries, and industries? For virtually every artificial source of greenhouse gas emissions, there are alternatives or mitigations which can be put in place. That is why it is encouraging to see industry transition plans being developed both nationally and globally, which will help each sector of our global economy onto practical pathways to a zero-carbon, nature-positive future. And, ladies and gentlemen, fifthly, how can we forge an ambitious new vision for the next 100 years? How can we draw on the extraordinary ingenuity of our societies, the ideas, knowledge and energy of our young people, our artists, our engineers, our communicators, and importantly, our indigenous peoples, to imagine a sustainable future for people everywhere, a future that is in harmony with nature, not set against her. Ladies and gentlemen, in your hands is an unmissable opportunity to keep our common hope alive. I can only urge you to meet it with ambition, imagination, and a true sense of the emergency we face, and together with a commitment to the practical action upon which our shared future depends. After all, ladies and gentlemen, in 2050, our grandchildren won't be asking what we said. They will be living with the consequences of what we did or didn't do. So if we act together to safeguard our precious planet, the welfare of all our people will surely follow. Teaches us that we are all connected, not only as human beings, but with all living things and all that sustains life. As part of this grand and sacred system, harmony with nature must be maintained. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth.
The King ending there by saying the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth, and saying by 2050 our grandchildren won't be asking about what we said, but rather living with the consequences of what we did. He urged world leaders in front of him to keep our hope alive and said that the hope of the world rests on your shoulders. He'd said earlier that it worries me greatly that we're so far off track our climate targets. Well, our science editor Tom Clark is at the conference for us now, and he has, of course, been listening to that opening speech by the King with a very clear message. Warm applause afterwards, and no doubt striking the right note for the type of attendees that are there, Tom. And now the focus will turn to the world leaders that he just laid down the gauntlet for.
Absolutely. And when I spoke to you earlier, Wilf, I was saying that, the King, in a way, was a kind of warm-up act to get people in the mood, but what was interesting about that speech, it was quite technical. It wasn't just full of kind of eco-platitudes about how we must all come together, although there was some stuff like that in the speech. Listening to it, he laid out 5 very clear areas of action, things that we need to do, and looking at them in detail, they're actually quite cleverly designed to appeal to specific needs and interests that are represented at a summit like this. There would be a lot of detail in there that would please certain groups. There was stuff on forests, there was mentions of indigenous peoples, there was the role of a fair transition. These are important words for people at a summit like this to hear, and that speech was quite carefully calculated. But I also think, the King letting out also his position that he believes, and anyone who's listened to or watched any of his thinking on the environment, very much about how nature comes first, this idea of nature-based solutions. And that is something that often doesn't get talked enough about at these summits. So focused as they are on fossil fuels and decarbonisation, the need for planting forests, protecting the natural world as a natural and powerful sink for carbon is really important. So that we've gone down very well indeed.
And Tom, talk us through some of the world leaders, from the UK side. Obviously, we talked a bit about the Prime Minister earlier as well. Who else from the UK side is there? Our Energy and Net Zero Secretary Claire Coutinho is here. David Cameron, Foreign Secretary, is also going to be here. Interestingly, a few months ago, there was speculation that the UK was, going a bit cold on climate because of the sort of rhetoric we've been hearing from Rishi Sunak's number 10. You look at the team they've fielded to this year's COP, it's actually a bigger and more punchy one than we've fielded in recent years. But there is this looming question of whether we have to re-establish our position as a climate leader because of that kind of rhetoric. And I caught up with David Cameron, actually, as he was hurtling towards listening to the King's speech earlier.
Mr Cameron, Sky News, just wanted to quickly ask you, do we have our work cut out now to re-establish our reputation as a leader?
We've got an unbelievably strong record.
The rhetoric doesn't
never mind the rhetoric. We have cut carbon emissions by 50%. That's faster than any major country, and our ambition for the next period is again faster than any major country. So if you look at the results and you look at what we've committed to, I think we are absolutely a leader on climate change.
The Prime Minister calls out eco-zealots at a climate summit? Of course. Now, of course, the former Prime Minister, David Cameron, our Foreign Secretary, is correct. We have done a lot to decarbonise our economy. The UK has shown leadership on this issue. But compared to other countries right now, what's been happening in the UK in recent years has not been as fast and as enthusiastic as some of our wealthier neighbours. We're still up there, but a lot of people who technically know these arguments would argue we couldn't claim to be a leader right now. And that's reflected in the fact that even our own Committee on Climate Change, that's set up by an Act of Parliament to hold the government to account on its net zero progress, is saying that as things currently stand, we're risking not making our more immediate 2028 carbon targets. And the next one, 2030 time, currently we just don't have tight policies in place to deliver on that. So Rishi Sunak says he doesn't want to unfairly punish British people or make it unaffordable for them to reach to net zero. So really the onus is on him and the government to come up with policies and fund them adequately to do that if they want to have this kind of position, this kind of leadership position, and have people believe that at a climate summit.
Tom, great stuff as always, and we'll be back out with Tom and the team throughout the day at the COP28 summit. For a bit further reaction and analysis, I'm joined now by Mary Robson, Chair of the Elders, former President of Ireland, and also former UN Special Envoy on climate change. Thanks so much for joining me, Mary. My question about this gathering relates to something that the King just said, and he spoke about the landmark moment of hope and optimism that was delivered at COP21 in Paris. Of course, we're at COP28 now. Do you think that there's something to what he was saying there? Have the COPs in between now and then somewhat failed to deliver? And does COP28 need to change that in a meaningful way? Because we do have these every year, and yet we're still talking about this climate emergency.
Yes, that was an excellent speech by King Charles. I'm glad that he felt able to speak as one would hope he would, because he has a great reputation in the climate space. And he really laid out cleverly by asking the right questions. If you look through the 5 major questions he was asking, you've got most of the things we need to do. And those questions are very relevant. And we have failed since Paris. If only, after Paris, we had really committed and seen the resources that were needed for developing countries to get into clean energy, the cutting of emissions by historic and large emitters, which we have not seen. The stocktake proves that. It was a very substantive speech. I was really very impressed. And it doesn't take from the fact that countries have reneged on their commitments in recent years.
And the US, of course, perhaps most high profile on that list. But before we get to that, I wondered what your take was on the fact that the UAE is hosting this summit and your take on the job that they've done. There was a couple of stories a week or so ago about whether they were going to use it to strike other oil deals. Do you see it more as a negative or a big positive that an oil-producing nation is wanting to host this sort of summit?
The way I put it in a recent op-ed in the Financial Times was, we can't afford a bad COP. So we have to almost, live with the perceptions and more than perceptions of being too close to the oil and gas lobbies, etc. The presidency, I think, is a bit compromised, but nonetheless, we saw a very good start. The fact that there was an announcement on loss and damage and some funding, not enough, but at least the start of some funding into that at least, sets a right approach. But actually, there's a great deal to do at this COP. And I'm not going to be following so much what happens in pledges by corporations that they do X or Y. I'm going to be following the governments and what they're going to do about the global stocktake, because we have to phase out, as His Majesty said, we have to phase out fossil fuel. And if we're to stay at or below 1.5, which is the only livable future world, then we have to peak by 2025 and reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030. That's 6 years away now. It's really a very big task. And the point is, if this COP can use the phase out unequivocally of fossil fuel, we will do it. I have no doubt. We're on the cusp of a clean energy world. We only have to move faster. That's a human issue. And I think the questions the King put in his speech were very good, as was the speech of the Secretary General. I mean, he set out absolutely that we have to phase out for 1.5, that we have to triple renewable energy, which is true, and that we have to have, both on the adaptation and the mitigation side, a great mitigation of use of energy and access to clean, affordable energy. And these are the essential issues.
Mary Robertson, I'm afraid we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Now, time to pivot back to the sport. Jackie's here with me for that.
Good morning. Yeah, very tough night last night for the police in Birmingham. I think they might have anticipated there was going to be a little bit of trouble. Not a single Leisure Warsaw fan was allowed in last night. This is what happened.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
John, welcome to Old Trafford.
Thanks very much.
You're a man of many talents, but we're interested in you today for one major reason.
Okay.
Season ticket holder at Manchester United, and you tell me you're in the where?
I believe I'm in the E of Manchester, towards the back of that bottom tier there. Every time I sort of do a job or sign on to something, I always think, well, at least that's my season tickets secured for another season. It's always my priority. I'd hate to be without it.
Can you have any recollection of that, the first time you actually walked through the steps or the pitch, saw the players?
Oh, I just couldn't believe it. I've got very, very clear memories of that game. It was New Year's Day, 2003, and we played Sunderland at Old Trafford, and it was kind of the perfect first game to go to, really. That was in the era when we had Scholesy starting, and we had Beckham starting, we had Coutinho starting, and I just couldn't believe that I was seeing them all of a sudden.
So this is David Beckham asking you for a picture. Look how happy he is to be posing with you.
I know. and the weird thing about it was that, David Beckham's not somebody who maintains a look for very long. I don't know how long he kept that for, but I remember the first time I saw him, on this pitch down there, was his sort of 2003 long blonde hair phase. So the fact that when I met him, he had a similar look going on. It was just like he'd walked out. He was like he'd walked off my bedroom wall. And then the cutest thing was, probably about a year later, I met Brooklyn at a thing.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
So is watching sport as a fan a level playing field? Recent research suggests that navigating the sports and entertainment world can be a struggle for people with additional needs. Well, someone who can tell us about her experience with ADHD is former Lioness Claire Rafferty, and she joins me now. Claire, and thanks so much for coming into the studio. What sort of things are still lacking at sports venues for fans with additional needs?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. In my own experiences, I feel like sometimes there isn't that safe space for fans to experience games, music events. And I think that is the key. There needs to be an environment where everyone is welcome and included, and it's accessible to all.
So you're saying, as someone with ADHD, you need somewhere else to go if you need it. What's your experience been with your illness?
Yeah, personally, having a neurodiversity as I do, I find crowded spaces quite overwhelming. And so having that quiet area, somewhere where you can get away from the noise, get away from the crowded environment is key. And in my experiences, I often go to football games and have to leave at half-time because it can be overwhelming and then over-emotional.
And Wembley, where we're going to be tonight, that's seen as a progressive place. So briefly, what have they done?
Yeah, so Wembley now has 2 sensory rooms, which are split into 2. So let's say we've got a game tonight. There is a home and away area, which can be decorated in terms of the team colours, which make for an authentic fan experience. And I also think that it's not just about those neurodiversity needs, it's about the wheelchair access, you know, the closeness to toilets, that quiet space. And I think that individual needs are key to be met.
Yeah, and they've thought about this. So we are at Wembley tonight. Lionesses have got to win if they're going to go through the Nations League and to qualify for the Olympics, which is unheard of. We're absolutely out of time. They've got the Netherlands. How tough is this?
Very tough. Look, I think it's going to be a big, big game. England have to win. And, yeah, we'll all be behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe Beth Mead gets her chance to play for the first time in over a year. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Back after this.
The 5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Good morning, it is 9 o'clock. This is Sky News Breakfast. The COP28 climate summit has opened with a fire and brimstone warning from the UN chief and a plea and a prayer for a turning point from King Charles. We'll be live to Dubai. We'll also go live to Jerusalem after fighting between Israel and Hamas has resumed with full force this morning. And we'll be looking ahead to the former Health Secretary Matt Hancock's second day at the COVID inquiry. It is Friday, the 1st of December.
We cannot save a burning planet via fire holes of fossil fuels.
In 2050, our grandchildren won't be asking what we said. They will be living with the consequences of what we did or didn't do.
I'm live in Dubai, where the King has spoken and the leaders are here. It's time for them to get down to business.
Israel has resumed its combat operations in Gaza after a humanitarian pause between Israel and Hamas expired this morning.
Also this morning, Buckingham Palace is considering all options after the King and the Princess of Wales have been named in unsubstantiated claims as the royals who questioned what skin colour Harry and Meghan's unborn son would have. Former Health Secretary Matt Hancock has admitted that despite his assurances, the country's care homes were not fully protected ahead of the second part of his session at the COVID inquiry. Snow continues to blanket parts of the country, with temperatures expected to drop as low as -10 and yellow weather warnings still in place.
And in sport, police make 39 arrests outside Villa Park, with 4 officers injured in clashes with Legia Warsaw fans. Elsewhere in Europe, Liverpool, Brighton and West Ham secured their places in the knockout stages of the Europa League.
Good morning again to you. Well, the King and the Prime Minister are in Dubai for the COP28 summit, where the King has told world leaders that the hope of the world rests on decisions taken by them at this UN summit. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, addressed the COP climate summit and gave an impassioned speech about the need to tackle the climate crisis.
We cannot save a burning planet via fire holes of fossil fuels. We must accelerate a just, equitable transition to renewables. The science is clear. The 1.5-degree limit is only possible if we ultimately stop burning all fossil fuels. Not reduce, not abate, phase out with a clear time frame aligned with 1.5 degrees.
Dealing with this is a job for us all. Change will come by working together and making it easier to embrace decisions that will sustain our world, rather than carry on as though there are no limits or as though our actions have no consequences. As you gather, ladies and gentlemen, for these critical negotiations, the hope of the world rests on the decisions we must take.
Well, our science and technology editor, Tom Clark, is at the conference for us now. And Tom, it's interesting, the King spoke about the landmark moment of hope and optimism within the climate world at COP21 in Paris. Of course, we're on to COP28 now. Was there an implicit suggestion there that the COPs in between have perhaps underwhelmed and that this one critically has to step up to the mark?
I mean, I think it's more of a suggestion that it's taken a long time, arguably, to not get very far. This COP is about checking. They talk about the stock take. That's the big focus of this climate summit, on how far we've got since Paris. And you look at what's happened to global emissions, they're higher than they have ever been. They haven't come down. The commitments to get there are no way near the amount that we will need to have any hope of getting there. So it's more of a comment on the fact we've got to move an awful lot faster. There's been a lot going on in the interim, though, and yes, there was a suggestion that not much is happening. They weren't as glamorous or important, those climate summits, but behind the scenes, a lot of deals are being done. A significant advance here at the summit yesterday was this fund for loss and damage for poor countries. That was a big deal. That's going to motivate a lot of people here to come to agreements. But don't forget, we are here in an oil-rich state, and look around us, it's possible to say things pretty much are carrying on as they are right now, and the King and Antonio Guterres making it clear that they can't forever. Yep, the UK's here. It's going to try and inject some of its own diplomacy on this. There was some criticism of the UK for not taking things seriously enough, but they fielded a pretty big team here. They've got to make up for the rhetoric that they've been putting out about climate change at home, however. And a few moments ago, I caught up with David Cameron, who is here as Foreign Secretary, to find out how much work the UK's really got to do to re-establish our leadership position. Mr. Cameron, Sky News, just wanted to quickly ask you, do we have our work cut out now to re-establish our reputation as a leader?
We've got an unbelievably strong record.
The rhetoric doesn't
never mind the
that.
rhetoric. We have cut carbon emissions by 50%. That's faster than any major country, and our ambition for the next period is again faster than any major country. So if you look at the results, and you look at what we've committed to, I think we are absolutely a leader on climate change.
The Prime Minister calls out eco-zealots at a climate summit? So the government, Mr. Cameron is right, they have fielded a pretty big diplomatic team here. We are coming, the UK, with some new money for things like forest protection. That's really important. But when he says forget about the rhetoric, I don't think people at this summit are going to be able to forget about some of the tone of the language coming out of Number 10 recently about how we don't want to impose environmental policies on people. We don't want people to pay too much. That has gone down not particularly well amongst many of the delegates here who are keen to persuade their government to be more ambitious, and they can turn to the UK and say, well, look, they can be a bit equivocal about it sometimes. So I think they've got a little bit more work to do behind the scenes to try and put that diplomatic position that Mr. Cameron was trying to put to me there and convince other people that that's really what they're talking about.
Tom, great stuff. Thanks so much for that perspective. And let's get another perspective, particularly on the political side of things, for the Prime Minister, who's been speaking to reporters in Dubai ahead of COP28. He was asked who he meant when he said he was not in hock to ideological zealots over climate change. And this was his response.
Perhaps the people protesting outside my house most recently, but there are people who think that we should get to net zero without any regard to the cost on ordinary families. I don't think that's right. I think we've got to be cognizant of the impact of this on ordinary families up and down the country. We have got an incredible track record in decarbonising in the UK, faster than any other major economy. We should be really proud of that, and I'll be proud of that record at my meetings later today. So we can get to net zero, but we can do so in a more realistic, proportionate way.
Our political correspondent Rob Powell joins me now. And Rob, obviously there'll be some reaction and pushback to that sort of angle amongst people who are pro-environment at the very clearly pro-progress on the environment at the summit. What about domestically? How is this pivot that he made 6 months or so ago playing out? And of course, Sir Keir Starmer from Labour is there as well, leading another delegation, presumably trying to highlight the difference they have in opinion and policy on this area.
Well, there is a difference in opinion within the Conservative Party on this. There are some that welcomed the weakening of some of those green pledges a couple of months ago. I think they felt it was the right response, especially after taking unexpectedly that by-election on the back of the ULEZ emissions charge row. But there are others that believe that this shows the UK backing away from these issues on the global stage. For instance, Rishi Sunak's former Environment Minister, Lord Goldsmith, said yesterday, just as Rishi Sunak was heading here to COP, that he felt that recent policy changes meant that the UK wasn't viewed as a serious and reliable partner on the world stage anymore, both amongst allies and also developing nations across the Commonwealth. Now, we're on the plane with Rishi Sunak flying here to Dubai overnight, and we're able to put that to him, and he made a very similar point that you just heard then. He pointed at some of the commissions around emissions reductions and UK technology and said, look, more broadly, he felt that the UK was still a world leader here. I think this is, though, trying to sort of contrast and reconcile the global politics with the domestic politics and party management. Yes, Sir Keir Starmer is here. He's here today as well, the exact same day. What Labour say the point of that is fundamentally they believe it to be in the national interest, that given that there will be an election next year or so, Labour needs to essentially be making these contacts and talking about Britain on the world stage. And I think the message they want to send out is that if Labour do form the next government, they want to see Britain back on the global stage once again. But it's going to be a whistle-stop tour for the Prime Minister today. He's only in Dubai for the day today, leaves later this evening. He's got a series of bilateral meetings and other more informal meetings with world leaders as well. Yes, to discuss climate change, but also to talk about the Middle East and what is going on in Israel and Gaza as well.
Well, Rob, great stuff. Thanks so much for that. And you've teed us up nicely to move on to our next story, and that is the fragile truce that had been in place between Israel and Hamas has expired. Sirens have been heard over Gaza and southern Israel, and Israel's defence forces say they've resumed combat in Gaza. Speaking the last few moments, the Prime Minister says he will issue renewed calls for sustained humanitarian pauses during his visit to the region. Well, our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle joins me now live from Jerusalem. And Ali, give us an update on the latest. How many hours ago was it that the truce expired, and what's happened since?
Well, the truce expired at 7 a.m. here this morning, so that's just over 4 hours ago. The mediation to try and extend it went through the night. But ultimately, Israel says that they were not provided with a new list of hostages that could be released today, and so therefore they blame Hamas for breaking the truce. And as such, combat operations have now resumed in the Gaza Strip. There's been a number of airstrikes in northern Gaza, but also in Khan Yunis, a city towards the south, a city that I think will become the focus of Israeli military operations going forward. But the Israelis have been warned by the Americans in particular to be far more cautious and precise about how they go about operations in the south of Gaza. They've actually published a map of Gaza this morning, and they have broken it down into tiny grid squares. And so the thought behind that is that they will notify, in Arabic, residents in Gaza if operations are going to be taking place in any one of these tiny little grid squares, and then they can ask them to leave. So I think what they're trying to do is avoid a scenario where they are going to try and force people en masse to move from one area of the Gaza Strip to another, as we have previously seen and as the Americans object to, and instead do it on a very much almost like, you know, a couple of hundred square meters basis, bit at a time. We'll have to see how feasible that is and whether or not it works. But the combat operations have resumed, and the negotiations to try and find another pause are still ongoing.
Is it fair to say the combat operations have resumed in a much more reduced way thus far? I mean, maybe that's just because, as you said, we're only 4 hours into this. But how keenly do you think the international community will be focused on how things develop in that sense in the hours and probably the days ahead?
I'd split the Gaza Strip into two, as the Israelis have done, north and south. The north is been widely bombed. More than 50% of the houses there, buildings there, are very badly destroyed, and Israeli forces have remained on the ground there in large numbers, even during the truce. It has also been depopulated in a large way because people have moved down to the south, and many Hamas fighters in the north of Gaza have already been killed. So I think it'll be easier for the Israelis to resume their military operations in the north with a similar sort of tempo and look to what we saw beforehand. It is the south which is going to be much more complex, but it is the south that, if Israel is going to achieve its objectives of eliminating Hamas and Hamas leadership, that they will need to focus on at some point. But I think it is in the south that we might see a different format of Israeli military operations.
Alistair Bunkle, as always, thank you so much for that. Let's now talk about the aid situation, and Tommaso Della Longa is able to join us. He's from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Tommaso, thanks for joining us. I guess the first question is how much aid was able to get in during the truce, and your fear that that will drop off a cliff now the truce is ended.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me today. Well, during the truce, we were able to bring, of course, together with other partners and the UN agencies, around 200 trucks per day. And the very good news was also the access to the north, which was mainly unreachable in the days before the pause in the fighting. Now, what will happen next, it's still a big question mark. And of course, it's always not a good news when fighting restarts. But we do hope that we will be able to continue bringing humanitarian aid inside Gaza. And the call to all the parties is the same as has been in the last weeks. We need to have safe and uninterrupted access everywhere in Gaza and reach people who still have and will have great humanitarian needs.
How high is your hope that aid can continue to enter? I mean, clearly, before the truce, after October the 7th, aid stopped to zero for quite a period of time. Do you think there'll be a middle ground found?
Well, I do need to hope that because, we believe that there is a dialogue. Has been a dialogue even before, since the Rafah border was opened. So the hope is that this will continue. And again, giving safe and uninterrupted access, it's a moral and a legal obligation, and civilians, anyway they are, needs to be protected and needs to get the aid that they need. Now, if this will be easy, it will not be easy, and most probably the humanitarian aid will not be enough. What we are seeing, also with winter coming, with rain coming, that the needs of people in Gaza will just grow. And we said it since the beginning, the more the conflict will go ahead, the more the needs will grow. And sadly, we are not able at this moment to give a proper and dignified humanitarian answer to the people in Gaza.
Just wanted to pivot you, Tommaso, whilst we've got you, to COP28, and specifically talk to me about the loss and damage fund that has been voted on at COP and the significance of that.
And of course, it's a very positive news. We need to acknowledge that. It's also positive that we started with this energy of agreeing on the loss and damage mechanism. And now, as usual, after the agreements, we need to see what will happen next. So how we'll put action behind agreements. So the hope is that not only for loss and damage, but for the next days and weeks of negotiation in Dubai, we'll be able finally to get what is needed. And what is needed on our side, it's really to get the money to the communities that they need the most, and really to put communities at the center of every decision. We need to work together hand in hand with communities to get solution, to work on anticipation and adaptation before it's too late.
Tommaso, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, from Alistair Darling's sad passing to Rishi Sunak's COP28 plans. It's been a busy week in politics already. No doubt there'll be more headlines in the next 24 to 48 hours. Trevor is here with me on set. Trevor, very good morning to you.
Morning, Rolf. I've been sitting here watching you and thinking, I'm really glad they don't make me do his job, because it's so busy.
Well, it is very busy. Do you know what? It's going to be a great privilege one day next year. I've been asked to do your job, so we'll see if that's possible. But
Damn it. I'm on holiday. Oh, God, you're going to do the job?
Yeah, I am.
I'm a bit worried now, because actually I might find myself on holiday and get a call saying, don't come back.
There is absolutely zero chance of that. But tease ahead. I've been watching very closely even before I got this assignment, but I will be even more to be taking notes and get tips. But what's on the agenda this Sunday?
Well, as you say, it's been a very busy week. There are big standout issues. COP, and we've heard from the King this morning, I think very interestingly, and it looks like that deal will happen, where countries like ours, give money to poorer countries to help deal with net zero. But the question is, will it stick? So we'll probably talk about that with the former Prime Minister of Australia, Julia Gillard, who will be on the show. I expect that as we enter in winter, health, Victoria Atkins, the new health secretary, who turned out to be quite a lucky politician, because the first thing that's happened is that a big strike's been called off on the health service, but we'll see whether that luck holds as the weather gets worse. And I think we'll probably, obviously, be talking about Israel and Gaza with our own people out there.
And Victoria Atkins, no doubt, will have some takes on the COVID inquiry. All attention will focus to Boris Johnson next week. I'm interested as well, your panel, which is always stellar, on addressing this topic, not just about what was and wasn't said by the King and the Princess of Wales, but how we've got here and who's really responsible for the revelations, unsubstantiated as they are, that have come out.
Oh, we're talking now about the issue of the baby and the skin colour and all of that. Look, well, I mean, one of the things I should say is that I think it's unlikely we're going to spend much time on that, because I'll be absolutely frank and say I think it's a nonsense story. I think that there is no family of colour anywhere in the entire world where that conversation doesn't take place. I have a grandson who is absolutely gorgeous and delicious. I wish I could show you a photograph of him. And, of course, we as a family talk about, is he going to look more like his mother, who looks like me, or his father, who is of Puerto Rican heritage? In the same way that, I guess your family might talk about what hair colour, what eye colour. We all have the same hair colour and hair. The thing that is different about us is skin colour. So it's a mark of excitement. I suspect, I have no idea what context the conversation took place in. I imagine the conversation did take place, but I suspect what somebody might have been saying is, I really hope this baby looks more like her than it looked like him. Well, Trevor, I had absolutely no idea, to be clear, you were going to say that, and it was fascinating to get that perspective, so thank you. And we look forward to Sky News breakfast. What's the full Trevor Phillips on Sunday? Sunday morning with Trevor Phillips. There we go. But who cares? Oh, gosh. Sunday morning with Will Frost. The key point is 8:30 a.m. Sunday morning. Make sure to be tuned in, as I certainly will be. Trevor, great to see you. Thanks, Will. Let's have a quick look now at the newspapers who've been dominated by a story that Trevor has given us a key perspective on. King and Kate in race row leads the Daily Mirror. And if we go on to the next one, please. The Metro, keep calm and carry on is their headline there. And Daily Express, similar story but different headline. They are raising the question, why is it an injustice to name royals in the race row? The Daily Mail says Scobie's defence is unravelling as he denies ever having named the royals. The Telegraph says the palace are to look at legal action over the claim of being named as, quote, racist royals. We're with me now, Milena Veselinovic, to give us this perspective, which is clearly summed up by these front-page headlines, that everyone is talking about this, and what's led us to this point, and what potentially is the reaction of Buckingham Palace, which could be substantial.
Well, I think what's most extraordinary about this is that what we understand the Buckingham Palace is considering all options, and you can kind of assume that that means potentially also legal action. And it is extraordinary to think that the royal family would mount legal action to protect their reputation. I mean, this is famously an institution that doesn't like to comment. They don't like to explain themselves. But I think it does speak volumes as to how damaging the palace is seeing these now sustained allegations of racism, because it was back in 2021 when Meghan first said in her Oprah interview that a senior royal had discussed how dark the skin of her unborn child would be. Now, at the time, of course, it caused headlines, it caused a crisis in the palace. Meghan and Harry later clarified that they didn't mean it was either the late Queen or Prince Philip, but they wouldn't say who it was, so that left a lot of room for speculation. And now these two names of the senior royals emerging in a very peculiar way in a Dutch edition of a book by a journalist called Omid Scobie, who says that he never actually submitted a text with those names in it. So how did this happen? It's a mystery. Now, I think it's also important to note that Omid Scobie, he also co-authored a book about the Sussexes split from the royal family called Finding Freedom. He said he didn't speak to them for that book. He says also he didn't speak to either Meghan or Harry for this book either. But in course of a legal action that Meghan had against a newspaper, it then emerged that her aides did brief him and his co-author for the Finding Freedom book. So I think that just shows the kind of risk that comes with legal action. Documents might be, submitted, witnesses under oath. We've learned a lot about Harry and Meghan in the past few years, but not so much about the royal family. So any legal action might risk peeling away some of those layers of mystique that the foundation the institution is built on.
Milena, as ever, great stuff. Thanks so much. Milena Veselinovic there. You are watching Sky News Breakfast. Lots more still to come. And after the break, we will dive into the revelations from the COVID inquiry from yesterday.
Hannah Thomas-Peter, and I'm Sky's climate change correspondent.
The UK is a world leader in wind power. Power, people! It's part of the Congo Basin rainforest, which is such an important ecosystem. It's known as the lungs of Africa.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. She doesn't really enjoy speaking to the press, and it wasn't clear right up until the last moment that she was going to sit down with me.
I might be just very naive, but I do believe that change is possible, otherwise we wouldn't be climate activists.
I'm confident for the last 30 years we have known how bad it is. I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to fight for the next step.
You can see just the piles and piles of stuff, these sofas and people's desks and children's books. And you can see inside this home here, people trying to sort out their home. It's just been devastating.
I think everything's at stake. The future of our planet, the future of the beauty around us, the future of you and me.
Welcome back. Well, climate has been the story on everyone's lips this morning with COP28 in Dubai. And earlier I spoke to the Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary Claire Coutinho, who said the government is committed to working on climate goals. I also spoke to Labour Shadow Minister for Industry and Decarbonisation, Sarah Jones, who said COP28 is an opportunity to pitch themselves to the global climate community. Well, Gurpreet here on set with me to discuss sort of some of the takeaways from this. And we also had that little clip as well from Lord Cameron, and it's clear that the government is trying to look at the long-term statistics that they can refer back to on this level, and has sent quite a number of people there, from Cameron to the Prime Minister to Coutinho and beyond. The question is whether that is enough to allow them to put themselves back up high on the agenda and as poster children, perhaps, for making progress in this area.
Yeah, so we heard the Energy Secretary really talking up Britain's achievements in this area. And she's right. You know, historically, Britain has been a world leader on climate. We were the first to legislate on our net zero targets. We've been cutting emissions at a really robust pace when we phased out coal. But in the past few years, we have been slipping against our own targets. And I think that's critical here because the pace of change, it really has slowed. And we've got a Prime Minister who has been reneging on key climate policies, such as that delay to that ban on the sale of new new petrol and diesel vehicles and the issuing of licences for oil and gas projects. And this is all in the context of a cost of living crisis. He's trying to present this as a Prime Minister who's compassionate about struggling families and the cost of the transition on struggling families. But, at the same time, he's talking up, how vital it is that we act robustly on this issue. And on the international stage, our international partners can see through this double speak. They can read between the lines with the Prime Minister on the one hand, who's saying Britain is so committed to this issue, but then on the other, reneging on some of those key climate policies. And it means he's attracted a lot of criticism from the opposition, from Labour, heard from Sarah Jones, but also from members within his own party. Zach Goldsmith spoke to our political correspondent Rob Powell, saying that these decisions that Rishi Sunak has made has really diminished our standing with international partners. Lord Stern, who wrote that landmark Stern review on climate change, also said it was deeply damaging. So although we had a kind of a slew of announcements today, we've got that 1.6 billion that's being put towards climate projects, none of that's really cutting through because the context of this is a Prime Minister who some would say is acting in a politically expedient fashion, lagging in the polls, and as a result of that trying to appeal to some on the right of his party by rowing back on some of the climate pledges that many in this country are very proud of.
Gurpreet, thank you very much for that summary. I think it's also interesting to see David Cameron not take the bait to criticise, which he might have done given his background in that brief clip we had of him as well. Gurpreet, thank you. Let's pivot now to the COVID inquiry. Matt Hancock, of course, was the headliner yesterday. He'll be the headliner again today. Let's bring in Ashish Joshi, who's able to, I don't know, sum up the key takeaways from yesterday, Ashish, and there were quite a few, and what's left on the agenda for today with Mr. Hancock and, of course, next week.
Let's start with your last question first, Will. Good morning. Matt Hancock will be giving evidence for half a day today. It was a full day on the stand yesterday, so half a day until lunchtime, and I think a lot of the time will be taken up with the other core participants. Yesterday he was questioned by Hugo Keith KC, the lead counsel to the inquiry. Today we will see the other core participants, devolved nations. He may even get some questions from lawyers representing the bereaved families. They've been here every day, and of course they hold Matt Hancock responsible for the deaths of their loved ones every morning when he turns up here. And every time he leaves the building, there is a protest, people holding photographs, portraits of their loved ones. So they want to make their presence felt, and I'm sure they'll be urging their counsel to ask Mr. Hancock some questions too. Yesterday, the takeaways were he admitted that the protective ring around the care homes might not have been as effective as he had led the country to believe. That was an important admission on his part, and certainly we learnt more about this toxic culture which Matt Hancock says prevented him from doing his work as the health secretary at the time.
Ashish, great stuff. Ashish Joshi there for us outside the COVID inquiry, where the focus will continue, of course, through today and into next week. Time for a quick look at the weather, though.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
The cold and mostly fine theme will remain with overnight frost, fog and ice, but there'll be a little snow around. It's mostly fine, if frosty now, but there's some low cloud and freezing fog in places, while wintry showers affect exposed coasts. Icy stretches are likely. Parts of central, southern and eastern England will stay murky through the morning, but elsewhere there'll be plenty of sunshine. Most places look dry, but wintry showers will continue to affect northern, eastern and western coastal areas, with a few spreading inland across southeast England. That's your weather.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, so to come here on Sky News Breakfast, we'll be joined by the Financial Times Whitehall editor, Lucy Fisher, and the chief political commentator for The Independent, John Rentoul. Welcome back. Well, it's been a busy week, a busy morning, so let's get some political reaction to all of the Westminster stories. With me in studio are the Financial Times Whitehall editor, Lucy Fisher, and the chief political commentator for The Independent, John Rentoul. Very good morning to you both. Great to see you. Let's kick off with COP. I mean, we've been focusing a bit so far on what the King said, a little bit of what the Prime Minister has said, and what's come out from David Cameron, who has doorstepped there. Obviously, Labour are there as well, Lucy, and this is one of those issues that there's been a bit of a wedge between the two parties growing over the last sort of 6 months or so. Do you think Starmer is there to accentuate that, or is this on the global stage he's going to try and play it a bit more safe?
Well, I think Starmer's clearly there because he wants to present himself as this international statesman, someone who is the heir to Downing Street in the general election next year. I think the difficulty comes for Rishi Sunak and his strategy, which really is to ride two horses. On the one hand, he wants to make clear, as he's told reporters on the plane out, that he's not in hock to ideological zealots. He's very much concerned about the cost of living. That's why the government is forging ahead with more North Sea oil and gas extraction. On the other hand, at an international summit focused on the climate challenge, such as COP, he also wants to stress the UK's commitment to reaching the internationally agreed targets, the 2050 ambition to reach net zero. So I think it's the government that struggle with the kind of coherence, trying to attack Labour for their expensive £28 billion green prosperity plan, while also making clear they want to be responsible custodians of the planet and the environment.
John, do you think the King's presence there and making such a high-profile opening speech helps the Prime Minister offset some of these questions, or actually causes a little bit of a further headache for him?
No, I don't think it does. I don't think it affects. I think the King very sensibly is staying out of politics because there is a broad agreement across the parties. I mean, there is, as you say, it is a wedge issue as to whether you're going to be proportionate and pragmatic, as the Prime Minister likes to put it, appealing to people who don't want to give up their petrol cars and their gas boilers. But on the other hand, he's trying, as Lucy says, he's trying to straddle opinion because everybody agrees that you've got to do something for the planet.
Lucy, we've all been focused on whether David Cameron would disagree with the Prime Minister on any policies. We're more talking about Rwanda, potentially China, but this could have been one of them because he was clearly one of the Conservative leaders that brought the green agenda to the party. Doorstepped there by Tom Clark. He didn't take the bait. He's happy to play the collective responsibility party line, it seems.
Well, yes, I think that's something he will have weighed up before agreeing to take on the role of Foreign Secretary. But I'm very interested to see how things play out today at COP. A lot of sort of speculation among Tory colleagues about whether David Cameron, with his sort of lustre, could sort of overshadow Rishi Sunak. So also interested, they took separate planes over there, not necessarily terribly climate friendly. I think this sort of potential tension and the threat of David Cameron overshadowing Sunak and making Sunak look weak is something we should all be watching out for over coming months.
John, one man who perhaps didn't seek the limelight for the sake of it, and maybe could have done a lot more so, as we've all reflected on his legacy the last couple of days, Alistair Darling. Yeah. What are your reflections on that point more broadly? I mean, it sort of always comes too late, doesn't it? But clearly his legacy a strong one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the astonishing thing about the blanket coverage in today's papers is that nobody has a bad word to say about him. Everybody liked him. He had no enemies. And that's quite unusual in politics. I mean, obviously when someone's died, people are polite. But I mean, in Alistair Darling's case, there's a genuine warmth to the tributes that come from all parts of the spectrum. I mean, George Osborne's off-the-cuff tribute. I mean, he was shocked to hear the news on his podcast and yet managed to just deliver the perfect, gracious eulogy, which I thought really was a measure of Alistair Darling's quality.
Lucy, we've obviously, with the George Osborne tribute as well, focused on the work Alistair Darling did as Chancellor during the financial crisis. One also wonders if the Scottish referendum could have gone a different way if not for big beasts like him, who are seen as Westminster politicians, but Scots trusted. If they hadn't been around, things could have gone very differently.
Well, I think that's right. And, it was with a sense of reluctance that Alistair Darling agreed to take on the mantle of leading the Better Together campaign ahead of that referendum in 2014. I also think that the sort of the difficulty, the opprobrium he faced leading that campaign may have been something that other Labour figures, other politicians in general, looked at very carefully when the EU referendum came up. And it may be that sort of watching how that played out may have deterred others from taking on such a leadership role in the later EU referendum.
Sadly, Lucy and John, we're out of time, but it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
OK, time to have a quick look at some of the newspaper headlines. The Times is leading with the COVID inquiry. Matt Hancock admits delays in lockdown was a mistake. The Eye leads with the Labour Party stance on the EU and its foreign policy commitments. The Guardian reports on COP28 as a landmark deal is reached to help poorer countries deal with the climate crisis. The Daily Star pays tribute to the late music legend Shane MacGowan, and that's the same for The Sun, with and the bells are ringing out for Shane. Well, next time you post a letter or a Christmas card, you could be in for a festive surprise from a singing postbox. 4 special red and gold postboxes decorated with snowmen, snowflakes and stars play a festive tune such as Jingle Bells and Deck the Halls. When you drop a letter through the slot, Royal Mail's installed the singing boxes in London, Swansea, Glasgow and Belfast to encourage people to keep actually posting Christmas cards this Christmas time. Jackie, I have to say, I love this. I mentioned it earlier. The only minor criticism I have for something like university sport, gold, love it. Red, obviously always there. Could have put a little bit of green in as well. That would be the full Christmas experience.
I don't like it because I think 4's not enough. Because
well, I agree with that.
I
2
want
complaints we've got. But so we support it.
Yeah.
But could be even better.
Yeah, but if I found one, I would be there going, 1, wait for the tune. 2, wait. I would be there.
Which you could cheat and do with blank pieces of paper if necessary.
Because you don't send Christmas cards, so that will be you cheating.
Time for sport, though.
Yeah, it was time for sport, and it was a really bad night last night. Not for Aston Villa, it was a good night for Villa. It was a very, very tough night for the Birmingham police. I'll tell you why after this.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality. Getting more people more active. Live life with Vitality.
John, welcome to Old Trafford.
Thanks very much.
You're a man of many talents, but we're interested in you today for one major reason.
Okay.
Season ticket holder at Manchester United, and you told me you're in the where?
I believe I'm in the E of Manchester towards the back of that bottom tier there. Every time I sort of do a job or sign on to something, I always think, well, at least that's my season tickets secured for another season. It's always my priority. Yeah, I'd hate to be without it.
And you have any recollection of that, the first time you actually walked through the steps or the pitch, saw the players?
I just couldn't believe it. I've got very, very clear memories of that game. It was New Year's Day, 2003, and we played Sunderland at Old Trafford, and it was kind of the perfect first game to go to, really. That was in the era when we had Scholesy starting, and we had Beckham starting, we had Coutinho starting, and I just couldn't believe that I was seeing them all of a sudden.
So this is David Beckham asking you for a picture. Look how happy he is to be posing with you.
I know. and the weird thing about it was that, you know, David Beckham's not somebody who maintains a look for very long. I don't know how long he kept that for, but I remember the first time I saw him, on this pitch down there was his sort of 2003 long blonde hair phase. So the fact that when I met him, he had a similar look going on. It was just like he'd walked out. He was like he'd walked off my bedroom wall. And then the cutest thing was, probably about a year later, I met Brooklyn at a thing, and I said to him, "Oh, I met your dad about a year ago," and he said, "Yeah, he told me." I was like, "No way!" This is a picture taken up there of me and my dad in the first game the first game that was allowed full capacity after COVID. It was against Leeds. It was the opening day of the 21-22 season. And yeah, there was just something about that day where there were times during the lockdown where we didn't know if it was ever going to happen again. You know, there are times when if your parents are getting a bit older, you don't know what you're going to do with them again. You know what I mean? You don't know if you know, you'll ever share moments like that again. So there was something about getting back in this stadium with a full crowd against Leeds as well, of all teams.
Yeah.
There was something about it that just felt magic.
Tell me about the other players that are huge Game of Thrones fans who are delighted to have you in their contact book.
My closest friend out of everybody, sadly no longer with us, but he's still alive. But he's just not. It was David De Gea. He was a big.
This Sky News Sports Bulletin is brought to you by Vitality.
Jackie, thank you very much there for the sport. Will still to come up on the rest of the show here on Breakfast. The Habitats of Hope exhibition highlights conservation success as world leaders negotiate a rescue plan for our planet. We'll be right back.
Street Child is about every child in the world being safe in school and learning. We focus our efforts in the world's war-torn and poorest countries. And look, it's a cause we just ask everyone to get behind. We know that without education, life's opportunities are incredibly narrow. But if you get just little education, everything is possible. With a bit of imagination about the future for the children you're seeing, the actions we take now can affect their 5, 10, 25-year view, and that's what we're about. There are 70 million children in the world of primary school going age who are not in school. So you could fill the entire of the British Islands with children who should go to school, just for primary school, and they're not. So there's a huge amount to be done. We began 15 years ago with one project for 100 children in a town called Makeni, in the north of Sierra Leone. We've just gone past the point where we've made an impact on the education of 1 million children.
Wow.
So a lot can be done. In Ukraine, we've been repairing schools that have been destroyed by conflict. We have been running sports sessions. The Times ran a piece over the weekend about football classes we're running. One of the things Street Child does is we partner with local organisations, and so we know wherever there's anywhere in the world, I think of a community there'll be great local charities. If something terrible happened there, these are the people I reckon that you would trust the most to come in and make a difference. But where would they get the money from? So we come in, I get to do interviews like this, people get to hear about Street Child, and we collect the funds, and we channel them through to those local organisations in places like Ukraine. So we support about 40 organisations in Ukraine, running football programmes, repairing schools, running play classes for traumatised children.
How many kids do you think you've helped?
In Ukraine?
Generally?
Yeah, well, generally it's 1.1 million at this stage, directly, and with the opportunity to be safe in school and learning.
It's like Emirates. It's like better. Fly Emirates, fly better.
Welcome back. Well, the National Lottery's announced the opening of its Habitats of Hope exhibition in line with the start of COP28. It'll highlight species that have been saved from the brink thanks to conservation efforts from organisations such as RSPB, the Wildlife Trusts and many others. Well, joining me now is the artist and conservationist Georgia Tucker and the singer and broadcaster Molly King. A very good morning to you both. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Georgia, I did mention that. Where is this exhibition first and foremost?
Yes, so the exhibition is at the Horniman Museum and Gardens, and the whole project's been supported by the National Lottery Fund. It's been amazing for me to find out that the National Lottery players actually raise £30 million a week for good causes. So it's been a real privilege to celebrate that through this project.
And that is on show in Dulwich.
Yes.
And so what exactly is on show here?
So there's lots of different elements, a very immersive exhibition, and it's celebrating the individuals who have rescued these lesser-known creatures from extinction. There's animations which form the creatures and particles and pollen from their habitats, and the whole exhibition is split into 4 different habitats: coastal, forest, marshland and heathland. And through that, I was able to use colour to make the work more creative and accessible as well.
And Molly, where does your involvement come in? Is this a passion area for you?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm a huge animal lover. I love to support animals where I can. Obviously, you know, animals don't have voices, and I think it's important that we can speak up for them and, you know, to help preserve nature and just get involved wherever I can, really, yeah.
And is Georgia's work something that you think is really celebrating this cause?
Absolutely, absolutely. The fact that Georgia's managed to put this exhibition on in quite a short time, actually. I walked in yesterday and I was blown away by it. It really is incredible. It's such a sensory experience. It's really immersive. I feel like it's a lovely day out for the whole family. There's just so much going on there.
And so, Georgia, I mentioned in the intro that this is celebrating some species that were close to extinction. This is revealing my ignorance. Talk to me about some of those that I should know about, and maybe some that I wouldn't know about.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have the flapper skate, which was saved by Sea Deep, which is a part of the manta ray family, and they grow to about 3 metres in length. And then you have the white-tailed eagle, which is the UK's largest bird of prey, the narrow-headed ant, the Adonis blue butterfly. So all these creatures, which are almost like family to me now at this point, they're really fascinating, and I think they're definitely lesser-known species who you might not know about, but they're so vital to our ecosystem.
Molly, did you recognise all of them as you went round?
I can't say all of them, you know, 95%, no, I don't. But no, like Georgia says, there are so many. You know, there's the great yellow bumblebee as well, which we know how important they are for pollination, puffins, you know, there's so many creatures that you recognise, and actually you might not realise that they are endangered. And, you know, the last thing we want is extinction. So, yeah, it's important for things like this to happen.
And Molly, we mentioned the National Lottery funding here, also tied obviously in with COP, which tends to be more focused on greenhouse gas emissions. This, I guess, another key part of what's being discussed in the Middle East this week.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a huge conversation right now, one that we have to be having. And I think it's just brilliant, actually, that the National Lottery are able to help and get involved. You know, like Georgia says, £30 million a week is put to good causes. And if it wasn't for that money, you know, I think we'd be in an even worse place, to be honest.
And Georgia, so it's Horniman Museum and Gardens in Dulwich. How long's it on for? It's already up and running?
Yeah, opened yesterday, and it's on until the 10th of December, and it's free, which is very important because my artwork is always accessible. I think that's really important to people, to be able to drop in whenever.
Well, thank you very much. Congratulations on the exhibition, and to Georgia and Molly. Thank you very much for joining us. Great to see you both.
Thank you so much.
Quick look at the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
The cold and mostly fine theme will remain with overnight frost, fog and ice, but there'll be a little snow around as well. It's mostly fine if frosty now, but there's some low cloud and freezing fog in places, while wintry showers affect exposed coasts. Icy stretches are likely. Parts of central, southern and eastern England will stay murky through the morning, but elsewhere there'll be plenty of sunshine. Most places look dry, but wintry showers will continue to affect northern, eastern and western coastal areas. That's your weather.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It has been a pleasure to be with you this Friday morning breakfast show. Thanks so much for watching. Up next, Sam Washington with Sky News Today and the very latest from the COVID inquiry.